welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalygin. And let me say, I am more excited for this episode than I've been for any episode in a very long time. Huge week of World War III analysis, and we have a huge speech for Metropolitan Neophytos. We want to read a lot of big developments as the U.S. is surging military assets, the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, among other things, to the Middle East. You know, the rumor on the street is that Trump called off a massive strike on Iran, that the Israelis realized at the last minute that the Iranian protests were not enough, that the regime was not truly in danger, and that now is not the opportune time to strike, to fully decapitate the Islamic Republic and the revolutionary government there in Tehran and install whoever it is. It seems to be that the audience and the crowds in these Iranian protests wants Reza Pahlavi, but others want a democratic government, not a monarchy. So we're going to be discussing the Iranian protests, how the Iranian regime seems to have successfully put them down, the response, the supposed death count. As we are recording this, the Iranian internet is still largely offline, slowly but surely coming back online. We're going to see exactly how that goes. Of course, Trump is, claiming he's not going to strike Iran right now, but that's as the week long. It's going to take a week, like I said, for that carrier group to make it to the Middle East. So we are really on the precipice here, as I said in the past few shows, really the past several weeks of shows, especially before 2026, February 2026, that's really when the tale is going to be told as far as World War III, Israel and Iran, Russia, Ukraine. It's going to keep going on for a while now. China, Taiwan, we're keeping a close eye on it, a few other fronts as well. But ultimately, Israel and Iran, these next few weeks, I think we're really going to be monitoring that closely. And as the U.S. military assets are not only deployed, but also pulled out. The U.S. and the U.K., Saudi Arabia have pulled out of the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. Several other bases that would be within range of Iranian strikes are being pulled out of. So we're going to be monitoring the situation in the Levant and the Middle East very closely, as of course we will also be monitoring Venezuela. The Venezuelan leadership right now, led by Delcy Rodriguez, is meeting with CIA Chief Ratcliffe. They have come to the United States in a delegation to meet with Trump and others at the same time that Trump is meeting with Maria Corina Machado, the neocon, puppet government that was awarded the Nobel Prize despite really not achieving much of anything. So we're going to be discussing the continued fallout from Maduro's capture and the U.S. regime change there. Obviously, we're going to be discussing Russia and Ukraine, the negotiations, how that is going, how obviously everything going on in the Middle East is going to impact Russia and America's relations. Huge updates regarding Turkey, Syria, Lebanon. Israel isn't just going to be going after Iran, of course. It's going to be going after all of Iran's proxies and all of their enemies in the region. The Syrian government is ramping up for a major operation against the SDF, so the Kurds are coming back into play. Metropolitan Neophytos has a lot to talk about that, so stay tuned. Here at the very beginning, I'm going to start things off with the remarks from His Eminence, of course, and also the Yemen situation. The STC has dissolved, the Southern Transition Council, the separatist movement backed by the UAE. So total Saudi and Houthi victory in Yemen as we speak. And we're going to be discussing Saudi Arabia and these other Islamic countries sort of drifting away from the emerging Israel-UAE axis. The UAE really went all in. They're supporting the Rapid Support Forces in Sudan, the STC in Yemen. They are supporting, of course, all sorts of other Israeli initiatives in the region, even hosting an Israeli base. Whereas it seems now that Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, Iran, Pakistan, all these other countries, the government in Sudan against the RSF, the government of Somalia against Somaliland, of course, which is a UAE Israeli-backed project as well. All of those governments are forming this new coalition that seems to be much more eager to resist Israeli and thus U.S. interference in the region. So really, really massive week. I love when we can talk about Metropolitan Neophytos and get a big picture on everything going on. But, we have to keep in prayer, everybody, because these really are fateful days. And as Metropolitan Neophytos himself said, I'm going to read the rest of his remarks later, but he said, "We have entered a very dangerous year and may be the supreme and prophesied year of the world war. Since we do not correct ourselves through peace, we will be corrected through a difficult operation." So if that doesn't sober you up to increase your prayers, I don't know what will. But with all of that, Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing amazing, Conrad. Exactly as you said, it's a very big week in World War Now news today as we cover both geopolitics and essentially orthodoxy, Christianity, how it's all impacted by it. And if you look around the world, you really have an overheating in the Middle East on every single front. You said Syria, Iran clearly, and southern Lebanon just failing to disarm properly. At the same time, up north in the northern new Christian lands, right? You have Russia, Ukraine experiencing the worst winter in 150 years, or at least of the last recorded history, right? So most likely since the Napoleonic Wars, since the War of 1812 and Napoleon's retreat out of Russia. So colder than the November early winter of 1941, which halted Operation Barbarossa. Extreme, of course, it's being felt not just in Kiev, but unfortunately in places like Belgorod, very close to the SMO zone. So everybody's really experiencing it at the moment. We're seeing all kinds of interesting news from the front lines, including, of course, which we'll cover in this episode, the second Oreshnik strike that took place a week ago, and now we know exactly which target it was hitting. So very exciting. And of course, the diplomacy, the diplomatic game of Vladimir Putin and Sergei Lavrov, where it's going to take us. And naturally, the entire news story, I think, of the last week and a half, more or less, revolves around the issue of Iran because it ties everything together. And you can see really the prospective globalist eye of Sauron really focus in on the land of the Persians as it seems to want to take out what appears to be the last bulwark, the last boundary before Israel's total domination in the Middle East. So a very pivotal episode to listen to, especially prior to what may be the next attack on Iran, which will take place very, very soon.
Yeah, again, end of January. I anticipate first, second week of February is when we're really going to see the fireworks start to fly. But everything is really moving into place. You know, the potential decapitation of the Iranian regime is coming about, which, again, whether that occurs or whether the Iranian regime somehow comes out with a strategic victory against Israel, or somehow even, you know, the prophecy about the 75 to 80-year curse of Israel being, you know, fulfilled and Israel coming to, you know, no longer exist, potentially being destroyed in some capacity, as some people prophesied. I mean, any of these things could happen. So it's a very fateful set of events will transpire here. But of course, regardless of whether or not, you know, Israel wins or Iran wins, it's clear that somehow, whether it be the U.S. power structure or the Israeli power structure, will immediately turn its eye, as you mentioned, Dimitri, this eye of Sauron from the Persians and the mullahs and the Ayatollah up to Ankara and Constantinople, and focus in on Erdogan and his political Islamists that are in his party and the, you know, Hamas allies that are currently in power there. And they will, you know, coup him out or make sure that his successor, when he dies of natural causes, is a liberal, pro-Western, pro-Israeli Kemalist who not only will obviously ally with Israel and prevent, you know, a sort of Turkish pro-Palestinian specter emerging to Israel's north. In reality, it will be a new pawn and a new, or even a bishop or a higher ranking position like a rook for the Anglo-American Israeli establishment to play against Russia on the Black Sea and against the Ukrainians. And, you know, Metropolitan Yophitos, his recent remarks on January 13th, which have been translated for us and provided here by Jonathan from the Eschaton Vigil, who hopefully we will be talking about soon. Also, really quick before I read these remarks, I want to remind everybody, please check out my recent interview with Metropolitan Mitrofan of Gorlovka. It is available on the Substack, worldwarnow.co. It will be linked below. It will be the most recent thing posted previous to this World War Now episode. So please check that out. An incredible conversation with a very pious and a holy hierarch of a very long-suffering city, someone that has come under Ukrainian fire many, many times. We discuss his veneration of the Russian royal martyrs. We discuss what it's like administering a diocese within a war zone, what it's like having your churches come under fire, persecution of the church in Ukraine, what it was like when his diocese was governed by the same Ukrainian government that is effectively now in power. So we discuss all of those things. And I also interview some refugees that had recently been rescued by the Russian military from the front line. So please check all of that out. It's some of my proudest work. You know, I made it all the way to the Donbass so that you guys don't have to. So be sure to check all of that out. But with all of that being said, let's dive into what Metropolitan Neophytos said here. And this first paragraph is somebody asking him a question, and then the remarks he delivered are immediately afterwards. So it starts, it says, "Your Eminence, in your recent sermon, you spoke about all these things that are happening these days in Syria, and you pointed out once again that we are heading toward the establishment of a Kurdish state, and it appears that this will be the beginning of many other significant events that will possibly change the geographical map of the region. I would like your comments, please, Demetrius and everyone." Oh, my Panagia. Look, within 1 week, such great events occurred in neighboring Syria that they now affect not only our East, the Middle East, but the whole world, the entire world. Even those who do not believe in the prophetic word of the saints called me on the phone and are now asking me, now that these things the saints told you are happening, should we expect something else? So, our metropolis, this humble metropolis, has published this calendar, Georgios, this calendar for 2025. It is dedicated to the 50 years of refugeehood, and inside there is also a text of mine, which is an interview where I speak of the pain of the refugee all these 50 years. On the back, we placed one of the many marches that the Morphites do, the Morphites being the people of Morphu, which is currently on the Turkish side of the border in Cyprus, at the beginning of October each year, protesting against the continuing occupation and refugeehood. And I said to our publisher, he says to me, "Do you want me to write something on this photograph which shows the march of the Morphites?" And I told him, yes, write 50 years of refugeehood, waiting for the miracle, and the Kurds. What thing, he says, should I write? Right, 50 years of refugeehood, waiting for the miracle and the Kurds. This was in August. Well, I'm no prophet, but I believe in the people of God who prophesy. And we had said long ago, both St. Paisios, who reposed in 1994, and also a fellow villager of mine, a chanter named Demetrius of Protopapas, he would say, "My children, you will become refugees. Many will die in refugeehood. But when you hear, either you or your children, that a new country has been established in Turkey, which will be called Kurdistan, then you will all return back. There will be no war in Cyprus. The war will be happening elsewhere." As many times as I said this, we would hear ironic smiles and comments. Now, I think that for the Kurds to make a state, it doesn't mean that they will do it tomorrow. It is brighter than the sun that it will be realized, no matter how many attacks and killings the Turks inflict on them. The false allies I mentioned to you before want it, the Jews. So the events, as I have calculated them based on the prophetic words of the saints that we are expecting from here on out. Because already the man of God, the hermit Antonios, who reposed, as I told you a few years ago, said that when the war begins from Syria, I think it has started, and this war will lengthen, will multiply. These things we are expecting from here on, and it is good that we know them, not out of curiosity, but so that we do not have fears and insecurities. The great ones have their plans, they have them, all of them, but God also has his. So then, what God revealed to his people, to the sanctified ones, whether he is called Cosmas the Aetolian or St. Paisios or many others, Haji Florensos here in Cyprus or Demetrios of Protopapas, well, many others, is this. First, there will be a great slaughter in Syria. The Jews will strike the nuclear program of Persia. They're already preparing. Either before or after this strike, Erdogan will fall. At this moment, Erdogan is considered one of the great leaders of the world. The president of America came out and said, the guy is smart. That's how he called him, the guy. What can we do, he says. This is how things are in our era. Whoever has the power of weapons prevails. This one, he says, managed it, and moreover, without much blood, he says, and they took Syria. He legitimized him in an essence. I will say another word. He fattened him up. How do we say, to fatten, to pamper in modern Greek? He encouraged him. He even praised him. So he did this on purpose. He set him up to start a war with the Kurds now. He's talking about Trump pumping up Erdogan. The Jews want allies. Their great ally, they feel, in the Mediterranean Sea is the Greeks, the mainlanders, and Cyprus. And in the east, it will be the so-called Kurdish state. 40 million, mind you, are the Kurds. So America is promoting them. And finally, we will have a clash of the Jews with Turkey. What does America want? America does not want, under any circumstances, to lose Turkey from the Western camp, but it wants to control it. Can it control Turkey with Erdogan in power? It cannot. They will find a way to bring down Erdogan. And this will happen. And those who will come out after Erdogan will be pro-Western and very, very much against Russia. So then, we will have the Russo-Turkish War. During that period of the Russo-Turkish War, the new generation of the Turkish politicians will strike in the Aegean. They will also make some incidents in Cyprus. St. Paisios said it. One slap the Cypriots will receive, so that we may be humbled. And then, when they attempt to attack and reach up to the 12 miles around the islands, the Russians will strike them so savagely that within 10 days at the least, most cities of Turkey will be bombed. Then Turkey will withdraw its troops from Cyprus, since it will see there the destruction the Lord is allowing to happen. This is how Cyprus will be liberated. But we said we will have another effect from the vaccines. We are already living them, effect from the vaccines, whatever that may mean. And something else we will have in Cyprus, which, when we are liberated, we will not have much joy, so we must be prepared for a great groaning of humanity. Plus the events that will happen in various countries that will not be military. They will be geophysical. There will be geophysical and biological war. Biological war is what happened with the vaccines. It appears that we will go through something again in the year that is coming, and in the following years that will have to do with illnesses and epidemics, pseudo-epidemics. So, and the most terrible is what will happen in various countries. Among them will be America, where they will have enormous geological problems, either with volcanoes or earthquakes, submersions, with floods and droughts. In Cyprus, we fear very much the last one. Haji Florensos said, a little cryptically, if God wants to close the heavens, well, it's his, he said. You understand that drought and lack of rain in Cyprus is an ancient problem, which requires many liturgies and supplications, not only dams and meteorological bulletins, and if we fall into it, we fell. Well, this is my own assessment. So the Kurdish state is not our goal. Our goal is how we will manage these events that in a few years will fall upon us, many of them. But the Christian is tested and reveals his faith in difficult times. May God grant that we also have faith to manage as our ancestors managed, both droughts and submersions and earthquakes and wars. May God give us also his enlightenment. Let this be our goal. My brothers, I thank you for being with me in this video as well. Blah, blah, blah, blah. It goes on. It's the end of the the video translation. So, I mean, that's amazing. That's basically Metropolitan Neophytos doing a little World War Now episode of his own in front of the people of his metropolis. So that was incredible to hear. He talks all about the Turks and the Kurds and the Russo-Turkish War and exactly, things that we've talked about before. He hasn't gone into this much detail in the past. Like we've talked about how, the Jews and the Americans are going to facilitate the overthrow of Erdogan, and then the new people will come in and they'll be anti-Russian. That is, exactly what we think is going to happen. And I wouldn't be surprised, again, that the behind the scenes, the intelligence assets that are working to make that happen are already, I think, very much in motion. And a big part of this, as you mentioned as well, was the moving of the 12 nautical miles versus the 6 nautical miles of the Greek and Turkish territorial waters dispute. Well, this is from Holy Wisdom recently that says Athens is preparing further extensions of its territorial waters, potentially including parts of the Aegean. Foreign Minister Gera Petridis confirmed. The issue remains highly sensitive as Turkey has maintained a casus belli threat since 1995 against any Greek expansion beyond 6 nautical miles in the Aegean. Greece has already extended to 12 nautical miles in the Ionian and signed maritime deals with Italy and Egypt. It also recently announced new maritime parks in the Ionian and Aegean, drawing objections from Ankara. Athens insists the only topic open for negotiation with Turkey is the demolition of maritime zones. So, St. Paisios talked a lot about the Turkey versus Greek maritime border, and it seems that in the midst of all of this Israel-Iran and Israel-Turkey stuff, that is also flaring up. So people might not think that a pro-American, pro-NATO, pro-Western, anti-Russian Turkey would have interests in going after Greece. But if NATO is somehow crippled or somehow stops existing in its current form, or even not, the Turks, even the Kemalist, Kılıçdaroğlu, others, Ekrem İmamoğlu, they've still maintained the Turkish nationalist stance on taking the Aegean Islands and reclaiming former Ottoman territory from Greece. So I think these are fascinating words from Metropolitan Neophytos. He, of course, is of the same mind as us that in the next few weeks, we're really going to see things unfold with Israel and Iran as the United States again moves the USS Abraham Lincoln. In the next week, it will have moved from the South China Sea into what I'm assuming is the Persian Gulf. And once that is secured, I think in that same way, we're going to see a lot of aircraft movements as well, probably, hopefully, at least from Russia to Iran with air defenses and other things at the same time. But I think, again, we are really in the end game for part 2. And I don't know if there's going to be a part 3. So we had part 1 with the 12-day war, which was intense, as intense as it was. I think, Dimitri, we had a pretty good time here covering it on the show. But I think what that was really a preview of what we're going to be seeing very soon. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on His Eminence Neophytos' remarks and just in general what we can expect to see here in the next few weeks regarding Israel, Iran, and these other surrounding countries and how that's going to impact what we talk about here on the show, prophetically speaking, with World War III.
Yeah, I think for anybody listening to the show for an extended period of time, perhaps from the beginning, or even new listeners, it's hard to disagree with Metropolitan Neophytos' words. Clearly, they also inspired by the holy people around him, some of his spiritual fathers, and his own spiritual life. But I think it's very clear that the analysis that he provided absolutely molds itself to the reality which we live in today. Have a look at Greece, Cyprus, Israel, their interaction. You'd think that a country that is predominantly Orthodox Christian, be it the Greek Cyprus or Greece on the mainland, would be, of course, somewhat skeptical of Israel. But no, unfortunately, these countries have been long subjugated. I would say Greece has always had this sort of infection of the Enlightenment movement, which has made it somewhat philo-Semitic from the very beginning in its opposition to the Ottoman Empire, naturally being so close to the British Empire, which was by that time, the 1800s was well and truly Talmudicized. And Greece at the moment is well and truly one of Israel's best allies. In fact, I think 3 weeks ago, so in late December, we did have a Greece-Cyprus-Israel cooperation military treaty that they've signed for 2026 to carry out Eastern Mediterranean missions jointly and carry out exercises, etc. So if Israel does have time sometime this year in 2026, you will and truly will see Greek and Israeli military naval operations together in a joint fashion. And also Greece has another very interesting connection to Israel in that they both have fairly large fleets of F-35 fighters, as well as all kinds of other Lockheed Martin, American-grade, very high-quality aircraft, which, again, what Israel and Greece do lack is these long-range aerial bombers, which is why Israel itself cannot take on Iran one-on-one. it needs America's long-range bombers that can carry those heavy weights, those heavy 1,000-tonnage bombs, and drop them on key locations, such as what we saw during Operation Midnight earlier in 2025 at the sort of end of the 12-day war. So I think what we'll see is definitely a further collaboration between Greece and Israel. And this again ties into, Conrad, what you said in Metropolitan Neophytos, that Turkey is going to be the next target. Again, Erdogan's Turkey is something that Greece doesn't like. It's especially turning the Hagia Sophia into a mosque. This is obviously a signaling that to sort of stir up the Greeks, but obviously nobody realizes that the false friends, as Metropolitan Neophytos calls the Israelis, are in fact going to be there waiting to reap the spoils from anything the Greeks or patriotic Cypriots do in any sort of conflict in the Eastern Mediterranean. There is no doubt about that. So as long as Greece keeps these false allies, in the eyes of NATO and Israel, there won't be any long-term benefit for the Greeks. In fact, I would even wager that St. Paisios' prophecy in relation to the Russians giving Constantinople to the Greeks, notice the prophecy doesn't include any mention about Greece actually returning to monarchy, or in fact the Eastern Roman Empire being restored. If anything, the city of Constantinople will be returned to the Greeks, but it sounds like it'll be quite barren, like a barren womb. So there will be the Hagia Sophia, some of the old ruins, and the Greeks will just need to turn it into like a new Chersonesus, perhaps a museum. Well, I mean, not Hagia Sophia, there'll clearly be worship there, but think about the implications. If the Greeks do not fix their own behaviors now domestically before they go out on these foreign political expeditions or ally themselves with the Russians or reap any sort of benefits from the fall of Turkey to Erdogan, they may receive a Constantinople, a Tsargrad without a Tsar. And that is, well, what can I say? That's like wearing a COVID mask alone in your own vehicle as you're driving in isolation. It's a similar thing to what Greece has today. It has many of these ancient sites and churches inside of its own country, and Russia today, notice Moscow, something's missing. There's the Kremlin, you have the Dormition Cathedral, but it feels like there is an absence, and that's because there hasn't been a coronation in the Dormition Cathedral for very long. And St. Petersburg feels somewhat hollow. That is because there is no Tsar there. There is no Tsar in Tsarskoye Selo, and the Third Rome is missing its emperor. It's Caesar. So I think the same feeling will be set in stone for Constantinople when it is under Greek rule, perhaps given to the Greeks by the Russians, if the Greeks themselves do not pray and do not, of course, fix themselves first and foremost, or else the Lord will not give them a proper monarchy. They will remain under perhaps quasi-Masonic rule for years to come, as they have for the last 200 years since the Greek Revolution, unfortunately. So I think all of that taken into account, Conrad, clearly what we saw leading up to the last weekend and even this week was a huge escalation in Iran. And Iran, of course, deeply is concerning for the entire region because the protests themselves, whilst, what the media portrayed in the West as the protests being hyper effective and perhaps the mullahs will be overthrown, clearly they weren't as intense as the protests of 1978, 79. If you go back, read some of the news stories, look at the photographs of the protests that took place when the Shah was overthrown by the radical Shia Islamists, you will see a much more different picture, much more extreme. There was hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. It's similar to how people were comparing the Bolotnaya or the Poklonskaya protests in Moscow in 2010, 2012, right, during that last period of Dmitry Medvedev's presidency in Russia. But if you compare those protests of the 2010s to the protests that took place in Russia in the 1990s, right, when Boris Yeltsin came to power and when communism was dismantled, you'll see literally, I think it was millions of people on the streets. There was at least 1 million people up on their feet in Moscow protesting. And you'll see, the famous rock concerts that took place in Moscow at the time in the 1990s literally had more people attending them than some of the protests in the 2010s. So clearly, and Maidan even sort of lowers itself in stature. So these protests in Iran, they are very significant, no doubt about that. But the narrative around them, Conrad, is also very manipulated. You can see that because they're pushing this story of, this is the Neo 40 beheaded babies story of 20,000 dead protesters. And notice they shoot themselves in the foot because 2 days earlier to that 20,000 dead story coming out, you had very key figures in, shall we say, Iranian anti-establishment movements such as Patrick Bet-David come out, and he released this video where he says, well, I have inside sources from Iran telling me that perhaps the casualties are 400 in number, or maybe 450. So he gives these scary numbers, which he says, wow, this is speculative, but the death toll may be 400. And 2 days later, the mainstream media comes out with these reports about this exaggerated 20,000, which completely blows Patrick Bet-David's speculation 2 days prior to smithereens. So you can kind of tell how the narrative really is. It's a quasi-Ukrainian Ghost of Kiev-esque, like Putin is killing, stealing Ukrainian children. The Palestinians are killing, beheading babies literally outside of the Gaza Strip. These are all exaggerating stories in order to push further pretext for action. But the other thing is, Conrad, is whilst the protests are ongoing, it's probably not the best time for the US and Israel to actually bomb Iran, because you may actually kill protesters in them. I mean, it is effective because the Iranian authorities will need to deal with two issues at the same time. But on the other hand, if the protests are successful, you won't have to waste billions of dollars going in, flying your planes, risking the lives of Israeli Gulf state pilots and Americans. On the other hand, you may actually kill protesters in the midst of the bombing itself. So I think there's somewhat of a tactical calculation, which is why Trump is in fact giving them that 1 week break as the USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier group is moving back from the Indo-Pacific region back into probably the vicinity of the Straits of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf. Now, what's interesting, Conrad, is that all this Middle Eastern tension ties directly into like global trade, which I think is a more or less secondary issue. It's obviously global trade, tariffs, sanctions, oil, gas. They aren't the primary reason for all of this. Firstly, I think we have to measure things by their sort of spiritual impact, ideology, culture, etc. And economics, I think, comes second, but still not to be neglected, the fact that the Straits of Hormuz are closed, which Iran did threaten last year in June 2025. You will see huge impact on countries like Pakistan, India, China, all those countries that receive gas and primarily oil and other exporting goods from the Persian Gulf, which includes countries like UAE, Qatar. They also export via the Straits of Hormuz, and Iran itself. A lot of their port cities will not be able to function if Iran does close those. So you're going to have a huge, essentially might force the entire world into a massive recession, essentially. So we will see the absolute bear market, not just with cryptocurrency, but with all stock shares. I think most likely, not sure if the price of gold and silver will go up and down. I mean, they're experiencing quite a bull rush at the moment, but in any case, China will be negatively impacted by all of this. Notice with the entire Venezuela situation, Conrad, it's slightly different because you had Maduro's fall leading to essentially Chinese assets being somewhat protected. The Chinese investment in Venezuela is not necessarily impacted as of yet. There hasn't been any like Chinese corporations or Chinese businesses or Chinese investments that haven't been nationalized. They haven't even been sanctioned or frozen like the Russian assets being frozen in Europe, in Brussels, for example, during the beginning of the SMO. I think Trump's playing very carefully ever since that October 2025 freezing of the sanctions between, when him and Xi Jinping, they came to a certain understanding. So that tension being put on hold, this ceasefire since October 2025 may be, of course, thawed and unfrozen if, again, something happens with Iran. Now, on the ground itself, clearly it'll be very difficult for any ground-based operation. By scale, it will, and look, we can't say that it hasn't happened before. The Gulf War operation in 1990, right? In the early 1990s, that entire setting all of that up, and of course then dismantling it, took up to 1 million American servicemen, like not just military, naval, all kinds of people, even including public servants and American private businesses who needed to go there in order to service the massive American military expedition in the Gulf states and in Iraq. The Iraq 2003 war, hundreds of thousands of Americans needed to go abroad. In the Iran operation, even if there is a partial land grab, and I mean primarily in southwestern Iran and western Iran, those oil fields. And I say this because when Americans went into Syria and Iraq, they did secure the oil exporting zones quickly, and they actually planted troops there, including Blackwater, etc. They used specific commando regiments in order to secure them, right? The same thing will probably happen in Iran. If there is an incursion into Iran on the ground, Conrad, as well as obviously preceding that a huge bombardment by air and probably by the American Navy, most definitely those oil locations that Iran and Iraq had a huge war over in the 1970s and early 80s, like that, those are going to be what America will probably see. So we're not going to be talking, the Americans won't be driving their tanks into Tehran perhaps, right? Unless they're very confident and they have a perfect plan for how to conduct it and they're willing to risk everything. But most definitely those oil, Mr. Rajenia, as you would say in Russian, they're most definitely being seized in Western. And most likely they're going to do that in conjunction with taking out some of those IRGC cells in Iraq and probably maybe even working with the Iraqi government, which at the moment has remained somewhat skeptical of any military incursion. But let's just call it what it is. The Iraq government is similar to al-Shara al-Jalani's government in Syria. It's subjugated. As skeptical as they may appear, as anti-war as they may be speaking, of course, when America pulls the lead, pulls the leash, they will be obeying. So the entire Iran operation clearly is going to put a lot of Americans at risk, not just the fighters of the aircraft, but also those in the Navy. Because if we see a single aircraft carrier go down, and in fact, we haven't seen a huge loss of American naval life since probably the Second World War against the Japanese, right? When the Americans mass-produced aircraft carriers and all kinds of other naval vessels, and that war got very intense on the sea. You did see American losses. That may again reoccur. And as Vladimir Makhnach, the Russian historian, said in the early 2000s, if the Serbians managed to take out a single aircraft carrier, right, in the Adriatic Sea, in the Mediterranean during the bombing of Yugoslavia, the entire war may have stopped, because again, it would have absolutely caused the domestic frustration at home, because one aircraft carrier lost means tens of thousands of family members in America celebrating funerals, being upset at the fact that, their relatives, their sons, daughters, nephews have just been killed in some sort of overseas expedition. So you'll see frustration in America at home, as you said in early episodes, Conrad, as unfortunately you're going to have American coffins come home. But all that being put to the task, we have seen Trump, in terms of military calculation, Operation Midnight Hammer, Operation Stealing Maduro, let's just call it that, have been very successful with no losses of American lives. So in fact, we see Trump as not somebody like a Bill Clinton or even George W. Bush, who's somebody who's very calculated. Things are done very in a show-like WWE fashion. But just like WWE and WWF, the wrestling is somewhat fake. Like, there is no real damage being caused. There's no proper soft tissue hurting of the joints. There's obviously just bruising. And this is sort of what Trump's foreign policy appears to be like. And we will see if that naturally goes by the road of Venezuela and by the Operation Midnight Hammer, if it'll be a show that Trump puts on with the Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier, or if it'll be what we saw against the Houthis and the Yemenis when Trump did in fact kill many, many of these oppositionary people to America who, again, also hated Israel, i.e. the Houthis, whom he bombed. There was, I think, 2 rounds of bombing. And again, the bombing usually, just like most of Trump's operations, Conrad, including Venezuelan extraction of Maduro, took place on the weekend. Soleimani's killing also took place on the weekend. So maybe this is a modus operandi for this new Trump, Venezuelan, Middle Eastern style, is where you strike on the weekends for whatever reason. So it will be interesting to see how all of this transpires. But the entire Middle East has so many of these different stories. But naturally, the biggest one, I think, is Iran, because the implications there are absolutely huge. I don't even want to speculate on the Bushehr MPP Unit 1, Unit 2, and 3, where these are massive nuclear power plants, which the Russians are currently building. One of them is actually, the Unit 1 is operational already on the Persian Gulf. So the Russians are building one more. The Russians are building the Syria nuclear power plant as well, and that's going to be in Hormozgan. This is south of Iran. Probably by capacity, the biggest one, 5,000 megawatts total capacity. So huge power producing nuclear power plant. So all in all, 4 of these units will be negatively affected. Russian nuclear scientists will be impacted. Russian servicemen on those stations will be impacted. And it'll be interesting to see how Russia reacts. Clearly, China will be negative, but will Putin finally join his long-standing allies in Iran and actually support them in the coming conflict? I think that's the biggest question everybody's asking at the moment.
Yeah, I agree. The Russians, they issued a somewhat stronger statement, I think, than they had previously issued. The Russians and the Chinese seem very willing to stand with the Iranians, but Putin, he's been going back and forth on the phone all week with Netanyahu and Pezeshkian. I think nobody wants peace more so than Putin. I don't think there's anybody that feels more strongly that they love both sides. Pretty much everyone else has picked a side, but Putin, Iran and Israel, they're 2 of his top prospects. So he's really sweating. He's probably trying his best to keep this all together. But unfortunately, I think these operations are obviously inevitable. Trump claims that he delayed the strikes because the Iranians somehow informed him that they weren't going to execute 14 people that were scheduled to be executed on Wednesday. I've heard that's just totally fake news, and that Trump is just using that as the excuse, because in reality what happened was the Israelis called it in. They said that we can't go through with it. The strike would only trigger an attack on us without toppling the regime. So they realized it wasn't going to go through. Netanyahu himself, I think, saw to that. So Trump had to come up with a reason why he wasn't going to strike, besides the fact that he just simply takes orders from a foreign government and head of state. But you mentioned, incursions into Iran, Dimitri. I mean, one of the main things that we saw during the protests that made it look like, oh, maybe this really is going to be a regime change operation was the Kurdish militants that crossed into Iran from Iraq. It was fighters from the PJAK and the PAK. Apparently thousands of them attempted to infiltrate all over Western Iran. But Turkish intelligence was shared with the IRGC, Erdogan, Hassan Fidan, and the Turkish intelligence, what is it, the MIT or whatever the Turkish intelligence force is called, who undoubtedly would have hundreds of agents embedded in Iraqi Kurdistan and Erbil and all these PKK militias and offshoots that they've been, waging, asymmetrical warfare against for generations at this point. It's clear the intelligence sharing was effective, and those infiltrators from those border regions didn't make it anywhere close to helping the protesters. They were all neutralized very quickly. So again, this is an evidence to how, Turkey and Iran moving closer together, sort of uniting together against Israel from the pro-Palestinian cause, is really giving Israel and their, plans for regime change in the region a lot of issues, because who knows, maybe if that Turkish intelligence hadn't been shared, those Kurds would have caught the Iranians off guard. So you can see here how, potentially even an operation against the Iranians wouldn't just include striking Iran plus its proxies in Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, these other places, but also potentially going after Turkey, probably under the pretext of eliminating Hamas and, creating a regime in Ankara that would no longer house Hamas, much like, the Israelis struck Qatar. It's clear they could do the same against Turkey, especially now that Turkey is openly, like I said, allying with Iran. And the question is will Turkey put the pressure on Azerbaijan, for example, during the 12-day war? We have many credible reports that Israeli aircraft used Azerbaijan to strike Iranian targets. Will Turkey, use their influence on Azerbaijan to make that not happen again? I guess we'll see if Azerbaijan and Israel have, their own under-the-table agreements that the Turks potentially aren't aware of. But you would hope that if Turkey really is turning against Israel and Erdogan really is this honest actor against the Zionist genocide and their, expansive Greater Israel project that's currently, being undertaken in the region, then you'd think that they would rein in their little brother Azerbaijan there, who of course are even more than the UAE still Israel's best friend. But the UAE, maybe they're going to be giving them a run for their money. But it's clear that, again, this is from Anti-War, it said the U.S. military told the Trump administration that it needed to consolidate U.S. military positions and prepare defenses before bombing Iran, as an Iranian counterattack against U.S. bases is expected. Iranian officials have repeatedly warned that U.S. bases would be struck in retaliation, and U.S. intelligence assessed Iranian missiles could target the Al Udeid air base in Qatar, as well as U.S. bases in Syria and Iraq. On top of these military movements, Trump has sanctioned new members of the Iranian regime. He sanctioned Ali Larijani, the secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, as well as 18 individuals and entities associated with supposedly facilitating money laundering on behalf of the Iranian government. He also announced that he would be attempting to do a 25% tariff on all countries doing business with Iran at all. So China, India, all sorts of countries that in theory America is even allies with would fall under these sanctions. So I don't know if this is, again, just more Trump threats and it's all sort of going to get forgotten when the bombs start falling. I guess we're going to see. But in response to all this, we did see comments from the strategic advisor to Iran's parliament speaker, Mahdi Mohammadi. He said, "We know that we are facing a regime change war in which the only way to achieve victory is to make credible the threat that during the 12-day war, although it was ready, did not get the opportunity to be carried out. That threat being the reality of a geographically expansive war of attrition focused on the Persian Gulf energy markets on the basis of steadily increasing missile firepower lasting at least several months." So that appears to be the Iranian plan. They plan to hold out for several months while damaging the world's oil market and trade by targeting the Gulf, targeting U.S. bases in the region, targeting Israel, undoubtedly. So this is going to be a real intense thing when it really goes down. And I think if it goes any farther than it did with the 12-day war, which was right on the precipice, I think, of spilling over into a worldwide conflict, if this thing lasts longer than that and gets more intense and there are more bodies, then undoubtedly we're going to see reverberations and conflicts rise up in Turkey and Greece, the Balkans, Syria, obviously. Russia, Ukraine might take a turn for one thing. China, Taiwan might go off. China might realize they need to make a dramatic change on the world stage as Iran, and who they seem to not want to allow to fall, is coming under pressure. Who knows what might happen in South America? Who knows what America might do with Greenland? We're going to be discussing that a little bit later in the episode. But it appears that, again, Trump is trying to make it seem like he's gauging his response based on Iranian treatment of prisoners and protesters. The claims are certain Israeli sources, as usual, are inflating the numbers, the death count, to a crazy degree. I wonder where we've heard that before, claiming up to 20,000, 30,000 protesters are dead. I've seen Iranian sources claim it's closer to maybe 2K to 5K people dead. That would include, I think, protesters and, Basij and IRGC and other police forces that had been killed by the protesters. Because again, these protesters were given guns by Mossad cells, U.S. intelligence. Clearly, they were operating with military people, getting these Kurds, to come over into Iran. I believe there were Baluchi operations that occurred within the 48 hours around some of when these protests were happening. So it really was a full court press on Iran. But it's clear that I don't know if there's been intelligence help. Obviously, the intelligence help from Turkey helped, but I don't know if there have been regimes shoring up operations that the Chinese and Russians have been engaging in, on the ground at a more diplomatic level. I don't know if, the presence of these new air defenses and these new things that the Russians have been delivering have given a renewed vigor to the regime, or if they really are just, emboldened by their hate for Israel. But it seems the regime has weathered this storm. We did see huge, massive counter-protests in support of the Islamic Republic and the Ayatollah that in many cases seem to almost be just as large as the anti-regime protests. So it's very clear that there really are people in Iran that support the regime, and the regime itself seems dedicated to its mission. But unfortunately for them, I think that's only going to reap an even larger and more absolute attack with the goal of taking them out from the United States and Israel. But unless you have any other thoughts on the protests themselves, what you think might happen in the future, Dimitri, obviously the strikes on Lebanon have been increasing dramatically. And I do need to talk about Syria and Gaza before we shift to other regions. But I'd love your final thoughts on Iran, and potentially you could tell me what else is going on in the region from your perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is absolutely clear that even some of the weapons that were being received by the protesters, they're absolutely outdated in terms of they're not weapons like machine guns, AKs, that even the modern Iranian military would use. So clearly they're exported and imported from countries like Iraq, Syria, from some of these places. Who knows, like which hands have even touched this AK-47, for example? Could it have been the hands of, the Sheikh Osama bin Laden himself, right? Or maybe it was al-Sharaa. So all this like dirty weaponry essentially is polluting now the streets of major Iranian cities. And naturally the crackdown by Iran is, I think, in many cases justified. And we have to say this very clearly. The same thing happened in Russia in 1905, 1906, during the Russo-Japanese War. You had Japanese spies, essentially, spy networks, as well as I would probably even contend with the assistance of maybe even American and British spy networks, create all kinds of frustrations within Russian capital cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg all the way back then. And what was Nicholas II's reaction? A huge crackdown on terrorism, on the protesters, etc., with hundreds of people being hung, actually. And there was military tribunals installed, essentially martial law, in order to shut down that nonsense. And that's one of the reasons the Russo-Japanese War ended somewhat prematurely with a ceasefire, because of those internal protests. So this is not the first time this sort of technology was being used. And to say that 800 people, I mean, Iran is a country, a lot of American politicians, including Ted Cruz or Rand Paul, for example, they don't know the size of the Iranian population, but it's clearly 90 million. So it's a huge country. And a few hundred protesters being hung is somewhat proportional to the number of actual criminals on the streets. A lot of these protesters, they all have massive criminal records. Many of them have served in dubious organizations in the past. It's much worse than, I think, any of the protest movements we've been seeing in Russia. It's, I would say, equivalent. Think about it as a new Arab Spring, a new Maidan that they're trying to force into Iran in order to avoid a powerful Iran rising up and potentially putting a halt on Israel's expansion in the Middle East. Because one thing they'll never allow Israel to do is move into those too deep into Syria. That's one point, and too deep into Iraq. And of course, that greater Israel project will be, of course, held back by a strong Iran. And Iran always had interests in that sort of ancient Babylonia province in the Tigris-Euphrates River. Iran did stretch itself out to that extent in centuries before. So there is this understanding that it's not just the Turks who have perhaps long-term geopolitical aspirations for the Middle East. The Iranians do too. And in fact, I think the Iranian model may actually be the best one if we really think about it, not just biblically, but also historically and recently, especially for Orthodox Christians. A more powerful Iran may be the best outcome for the entire Middle East, especially given what some of the cultural things that the Israelis push generally around the world, and some of their belligerents and people who hold Israeli passports. They push degeneracy. Iranians don't promote alphabet community values, etc. around the world. If anything, the only thing Iran really lacks from a Christian perspective, Conrad, this is the only fault we can kind of hold against them, is they do stop evangelism and proselytism of Orthodox Christianity in Iran proper. So you cannot convert a Shia Muslim Iranian I mean, if you're going to do so and you're going to promote orthodoxy in Iran, for example, you're going to have to be incredibly careful because they will prosecute you. And that's the only thing that we would probably have a contention with from a Christian perspective. So, but notice that's not what Trump is talking about. Neither is it what Netanyahu is pointing the finger towards. They want something more. They want abstract things like women's rights, et cetera, while at the same time, notice whenever they cry about over-policing, people getting hung, executed, remember what their positions were in the Palestinians. Mass slaughter, we can call it over-policing, police brutality. If what Israel did amounted to probably what we could call genocide at this point. Mass extermination of innocent people, collateral damage to an extent unseen before in the 21st century. Not even the 2003 Iraq War was similar to that of the fate of the Palestinians in Gaza and caused by the Israelis. So what we see in Iran right now, all this critique of Iranian political behavior, the approach is always hypocritical, two-faced. There's those double standards are being used. And remember who Christ criticized the most in the New Testament. Our Lord and Savior criticized hypocrites, the Pharisees. And that's exactly what's being approved of here. This criticism of Iran, but we won't be touching Israel or what Israelis are doing to the Palestinians. So therefore, their particular statements about Iran are null and void. The other thing we need to concern ourselves with is the women, the Iranian women, the hijabs and all that. Well, the president of Iran, Pezeshkian, he's criticized hijabs, the mandatory hijab wearing already. And Iran is, in fact, like probably Abbas Araghchi and perhaps Pezeshkian himself. These are people who are reformers. Yes, Iran has arrested 2 former extreme reformists, like right now, apparently, because they were on house arrest. They're not literally in prison. That's former president of Iran, Hassan Rouhani, and former foreign minister, Javad Zarif. So there's 2 former, literally very senior people in the Iranian former regime who are now in prison because potentially they were supporting the protests. But notice the fate of the Iranian women. Trump had al-Shara al-Julani, somebody who is a known holder of women slaves, concubines, and trophy wives, not just his 4 Islamic wives, allowed by the Quran. This gentleman, and Trump was joking him, how many wives do you have in the White House? Absolutely despicable. So somebody who is literally a 7th century Arabian warlord, Trump invites in. But Pezeshkian, for all we know, I think has 1 wife. Khamenei has 1. It's completely like the behavior of Iranians is very normative when you compare even to some of the behavior of other Islamic countries. It's not as extreme. And so that particular talking point, Conrad, the whole Canadian Iranian woman burns a photograph of Khamenei with a cigarette is just complete nonsense, because the Western regimes support the most Islamic, the most terrorizing regimes in the world at the moment. That is, Operation Timber Sycamore supported essentially ISIS and IGIL. You've had Russia admit, Alexander Bortnikov admit that the MI6, so British intelligence, was supporting ISIS Khorasan, so ISIS-K in Central Asia, and they committed Crocus City Hall. And we have HTS, former Al-Qaeda, the same people who were allegedly involved in 9/11. Obviously, now the government in Syria are being now paraded through the White House. So we have to keep all these critiques in mind when we talk about Iran. These people are the inheritors, in some ways, literally the genetic descendants of the Pharisees, and they will use the same tactics that they used during the time of our Lord in the early stages of the New Testament period. So keep that in mind. Like when they do attack Iran, they're going to use every single tactic in the book, and we just have to remain sober and just to make sure we analyze information carefully. And that's what I think we do on the show.
No, exactly. I agree. And what you said about Rouhani and Zarif being arrested, it seems that that's been confirmed. I haven't seen that disputed by any sources, but that's huge if true. I mean, Zarif has supposedly been one of the biggest supporters of the reform and the hardliner stance, anti-Israel stance that the Islamic Republic is, known for. So it's good that that is occurring. And, I just mentioned Lebanon earlier. The strikes across the Bekaa Valley have, of course, been continuing. And again, we are anticipating potential massive strikes against Hezbollah, a fully renewed war. Hezbollah has said that they're only going to strike Israel if the Iranian regime is actually threatened. But Israel seems that they might be willing to do a strike preemptive to that. Trump, apparently, the U.S. really wants Israel to take on Hezbollah, I guess, while the U.S. potentially takes on Iran. So very unfortunate developments from the supposed anti-war administration of Donald Trump. But Gaza, of course, not huge updates. Obviously, more Palestinians are still being killed despite the ceasefire. Supposedly, the green techno city that is being developed, is going to happen in Rafah. That's being discussed. And Trump recently announced that the technocratic committee to oversee the Gaza transition, which is phase 2 of the Gaza ceasefire deal, I guess has been decided. 15 Palestinians led by Ali Shah, a former Palestinian deputy minister of planning. But as this was announced, Netanyahu said, this is from anti-war, Netanyahu has framed U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff's announcement about the start of phase 2 of the U.S.'s Gaza deal as largely symbolic, as the situation on the ground in the besieged Palestinian territory hasn't changed. So he's obviously trying to downplay the U.S. influence, or rather the moving forward of the ceasefire, that a ceasefire is even really happening, because obviously his base in Israel doesn't want to hear anything about that. So we're going to be keeping an eye on this, but I'm sure it'll be dragged out as long as possible before any actual change or implementation occurs. The Israelis are just leveling entire areas and neighborhoods, fully flattening them, whether they be preparing them for settlements or just completely making them uninhabitable in the future. I don't really know, but they sure are doing a lot of work on Gaza. The other big announcement, of course, is Syria, which I'm going to tie some of the prophetic analysis into here with Iran as well. Obviously, Syria, one of the main places, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Jordan, Syria. These are the airspaces that Israel needs to launch strikes on Iran. Saudi Arabia, of course, recently said that they will not be allowing the U.S. and Israel to use their airspace to strike Iran. Iraq, of course, does have pro-Iranian militias that could, in theory, try shooting down certain aircraft, and I don't know if Syria would give Israel the approval. To be fair, Israel does effectively have rule over Syria's skies already. They also, of course, have the Azerbaijan element. So there's a lot of cards on Israel's table, and of course, the U.S. can just launch things from the Persian Gulf, obviously. So a lot of angles to think about there. But the SDF, the largely Kurdish group that has been, ostensibly the last holdout against the Damascus centralized government, supported, of course, by Turkey, Qatar, these other regions led by al-Jawlani, al-Shura. This recent announcement here, the Syrian Democratic Forces announced withdrawal from all areas west of the Euphrates River. The SDF, led by Commander Muslim Abdi, have announced their decision to withdraw forces from the current contact lines east of Aleppo at 7 a.m. tomorrow, which is Saturday, January 17th. As the time this is being recorded, the forces will redeploy to positions east of the Euphrates River. The move follows calls from friendly countries and mediators described as a goodwill gesture to advance implementation of the March 10th agreement. But despite, I guess, what supposedly is a goodwill gesture, this is from the Wall Street Journal. It says, U.S. intelligence assesses the Syrian government is preparing a large-scale Turkish-backed offensive into Syrian Democratic Forces held areas east of the Euphrates. U.S. officials warned that any push into northeastern Syria could put Syrian and Turkish forces against U.S. troops deployed there, though the operation's full scale and timing are still unclear. Washington has cautioned Ahmed al-Shara's administration that moving ahead with a cross-Euphrates offensive would prompt the reimposition of Caesar Act sanctions. But the rumor is that apparently the Wall Street Journal at least thinks that al-Shura, al-Jawlani have already approved this, and there's almost no going back. This is an inevitability. And we have seen an extreme increase in northern Syria of Turkish supplying SNA, Damascus-aligned groups, weapons, all sorts of other things, even troops. There are actual Turkish troops training there. So this operation could even include actual Turkish forces, and Turkish forces have been present in Iraq as well. And so again, think about this. Obviously, we just had the Iran thing, which had a Kurdish element that failed due to Turkish intervention. And Turkey, meanwhile, is about to go into Iraq and Syria and into Kurdistan and potentially, end Syrian Kurdistan, at least any kind of autonomy that it has with the SDF. And think about what that could do. Obviously, Metropolitan Neophytos in his statement implied that Trump was egging Erdogan on to encourage him to do this. Maybe Trump's playing 4D chess. I don't know. But if that happened, you could really see how the U.S., Israel would work against Erdogan, both to overthrow Iran by establishing an independent Kurdistan that would border Iran. And, in theory, they could incorporate parts of Iran into that independent Kurdistan because there are massive Kurdish areas with the tens of millions of Kurds that are in Iranian Kurdistan. So it would be a major blow to Iran. Obviously, Turkey, one of their foreign policy objectives is to never allow the formation of an independent Kurdish state. And so Erdogan would be working against this. So overthrowing Erdogan would also then fulfill this, the need for this Kurdish state. So that would be something that both Erdogan and Iran would need to fall to have accomplished. And it's a huge goal that the U.S., I think, and Israel have both been attempting to achieve for a very, very long time. So we're going to be watching all of that very closely. Obviously, if that operation has already, been decided on, then it's something that might, occur in the midst of the Israeli-Iranian war. The U.S. is going to be involved in, obviously, that we're about to see unfold. But in the midst of all of this, obviously, I mentioned earlier, this new bloc is sort of emerging with Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, the non-Somaliland part of Somalia, Egypt, Eritrea, Sudan, even Libya potentially. Meanwhile, you have Israel, the UAE, Ethiopia, Somaliland, South Sudan, the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, and ostensibly the government of Chad. Recently, the STC, the Southern Transition Council, obviously, that was the separatist movement trying to establish the state of Southern Arabia that would have been UAE backed and controlled most of Yemen's oil resources, completely dissolved after intense Saudi-backed strikes. And, now there have been renewed talks between Ansar Allah, the Houthis, and Saudi Arabia about a power-sharing agreement, which Israel and the UAE desperately do not want. And so it's clear Saudi Arabia has been really forced towards the pro-Palestinian side of the Islamic world, which again, as much as October 7th can be called a failure, all of the people that orchestrated are largely dead now. Tens of thousands, likely hundreds of thousands dead in Gaza as a result. However, if we go with the thesis that October 7th occurred to derail Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords, it was undoubtedly a success. Saudi Arabia has never been farther from recognizing Israel than it was right now since the Abraham Accords and the first Trump term with Jared Kushner basically at the reins really occurred. So in that regard, it was a successful operation. I think it's interesting to ponder that. But Dimitri, I'd love your thoughts on the Syria thing. I think the Syria thing, because Metropolitan Yoftos makes it clear that from his perspective, the Syria thing was what really started the Third World War. And when you think about how it affects Russia, the United States, Iran, Israel, Lebanon, Turkey, it really is sort of the true nexus of all of these conflicts that we're talking about. So it's no wonder that those who are prophesying and analyzing the prophecies and analyzing all this from an Orthodox perspective, like His Eminence is, has this focus on Syria. And I think that with this SDF operation, potentially with Turkey coming in, all under the shadow of the impending U.S.-Israeli operation against Iran, I think Syria is going to be, potentially the ground focus of this battle, while the air is saturated by Israeli, U.S., and Iranian fire back and forth.
No, of course, and we have to keep in mind that the Russian incursion, or at least the Russian invitation to go into Syria to fight against ISIS, the rebels, the moderate rebels, the white helmets, and all those other people, and essentially Turkish proxies, took place on the 30th of September 2015. Right, so end of the last quarter of 2015. Meanwhile, in the first quarter of 2015, what did we see? The mass killing, the mass murder of Russian Donbass commanders in Lugansk, Donetsk, and the complete freezing of the entire essentially Russian Spring movement, right? And the Minsk II Accords was signed in February 2015. So essentially almost 6 months, 7 months apart from the Russian expedition into Syria. And again, questions arise, like why did Russians go to Syria in the first place, as opposed to support their brothers, especially brothers in the faith, back at home, just across the border in Donetsk, Lugansk. One of the major points of criticism for Vladimir Putin's foreign policy decisions, but it's all swept under the rug now that the Russian expedition in Syria essentially has failed, and the decade-long investment into Syria has amounted to essentially 2 half-stocked bases in Latakia and Tartus, and especially the Khmeimim base doesn't seem to have that many aircraft there located, but at least it is real estate that the Russians can control. Mind you, Conrad, the Russian presence in Syria is very much contingent on the goodwill of the Israelis. So at any point, and as I mentioned, the fact that Israelis did not have those long-range bombers, but Latakia and Tartus are so close to Israel that they don't need those long-range bombers. They just need essentially just regular Israeli aircraft, regular Lockheed Martin planes can reach those locations, under an hour, bomb them and return back home. So it really is unfortunately that those 2 bases are heavily exposed towards Israel. So there's no scenario, at least in the recent future, we can think of, which will have Russia go against Israel without absolutely putting those 2 bases in harm's way. This is most likely why al-Shara al-Jalani was asking for Russian peacekeepers to come and join them on the borders of the Golan Heights and in some of those peacekeeping outpost areas, is because he wants Russians to be again put in harm's way. But unfortunately, Russia has got itself into quite a pickle. All of its African bases that it has, in collaboration with countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, Central African Republic, and Niger, like all those silver gold mines, the logistics point for them is the base is the harbor base in Tartus. But the Russians don't want to disrupt those, say the importation of those African goods, because their ships do need to stop somewhere. It could be Libya, but primarily it's Tartus, and they could they could unload some of those goods temporarily in the Tartus ports and keep them under safeguard with their own military there present, and then take them back up through the East Mediterranean, through the Black Sea, into Russian port cities. So it's understood that way that Latakia and Tartus, this is not an anti-Israeli establishment, very clearly. And necessarily, it's not an anti-al-Shara al-Jilani. It's just a Russian expansionary outpost for economic benefits at this point. It's not an actual hub of geopolitical pressure on anyone. Sadly, that's just a reality now that President Dr. Assad's government has fallen. But specifically about the Kurds, Conrad, yeah, it's the Kurdish conflict with the SNA, HTS is very obviously, I think, hidden behind a general distrust of the Turks, because the Kurdish angle can be used in both directions. Could be used against the Turks on one hand, could be used against the Iranians, because a part of what the Kurds consider Kurdistan does spill over into Western Iran. So that particular angle can always be exploited. This is why the Israelis and the Americans are hanging out and working very closely with the Kurds, because they can use this particular piece on the chessboard in either direction. There's a certain dynamism here. At the same time, you do have the al-Shara al-Jilani government, just I think out of personal expansionary propositions. Like, he does probably want to be an emir, and he does actually believe the Quran and the Hadiths and all the Sunni radical sheikhs and imams that he listens to. He wants to actually push out and create an emirate, a proper one in Syria. And these are lightweight Kurds who are friends of Yazidis, who are friends of all kinds of minorities, and not going to be part of that picture, despite the fact that the majority of them are Sunni Muslims as well. So they should be technically part of that emirate. But no, I think it's absolutely an infighting of sorts. Both sides are supported by NATO countries inherently. And naturally, it's just the regular Syrian citizens who are living in these villages and towns in the conflict zone who are going to be affected. But I think it's a big move pushing the Kurds out of Aleppo. And Aleppo and the Euphrates River, if you think about it. So Aleppo is up north, next to Idlib, not far from the old city of Antioch. Aleppo, in fact, replaced Antioch in many ways once the ancient city of Antioch fell. So Aleppo is really like the new Antioch. Aleppo's Kurdish suburbs have been essentially decurdified recently, the same sort of thing we saw in Western Syria when you had essentially Christian killings and all these other things, but less so here. And you had a big SDF, as you said, kind of retreat across the Euphrates River, which is located only about 22 miles, 30 kilometers to the east of Aleppo. So the Euphrates and then the Tigris are not very far from Aleppo. And then you're obviously in the center of Syria at that point, and eastwards, it's basically Kurdish-controlled territory. And I think we're kind of seeing the al-Shara angle, Conrad. The only mystery here, right, in the al-Shara saga is when the greater powers call, that is the United States or the Gulf states, which are very much pro-American, who will he follow? Or will he follow the Turks, his masters from Idlib, who, I mean, he was using the Turkish lira for a large portion of his existence there, living next to al-Baghdadi and collaborating with all the other al-Nusra Front commanders and former members of al-Qaeda. Like, who will they follow? The Turks or the Gulf states? That's, I think, the biggest mystery at the moment. It's really a flip of a coin. But in my opinion, given the proximity of Idlib, given where they were coming from, and also the absence of the anti-Kurdish angle of the entire thing does give it a very pro-Turkish flavor. And that's why I think in the end, no matter the presence of the Gulf states, no matter the funding coming out of Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia, to a lesser extent at this point, the SNA, HTS government of Damascus will ultimately turn and serve its Turkish master Erdogan. And this is probably why Israel, you can see it kind of looking at al-Shara al-Jilani with a bit of skepticism, right? Because this is not ISIS, this is not Operation Timor sort of servants, this is not IGIL, these are not like mind-controlled freaks. These are head choppers who are motivated not just by their own Sunni radical Islam, but in fact they are. The Palestinian Hamas like them as well. That's the other thing. And that connection makes Israel, I think, very uncomfortable. I'm not saying that makes them good. It's just we have to describe the particular elephant in the room we're looking at. And this is quite a grotesque creature. But now at the moment, it is pushing the Kurds further eastwards. And eventually the Kurdish, as Metropolitan Neophytos said, there are 40 million Kurds, however large numbers of them living not just in Syria, but in other places around the world, in particular these Middle Eastern countries. This is one of those pieces that will be used. And I think Israel and America eventually will need to decide, do they take out al-Shara al-Jilani? Do they work with him? Do they somehow obtain his loyalty, take it away from the Turks? And naturally, Russia's noticed it's not even in this discussion. I think the Russian presence, unfortunately, has been more or less lost. I don't care how many times Lavrov meets with al-Jalani, that connection is trivial at best. And that's very sad because Russia, I think, really does need to increase its presence in the Middle East in order to secure a stronger Iran, stronger bridgeheads to move forward. And you said correctly, Conrad, for better or for worse, Vladimir Putin at the moment does appear to be the only serious peacekeeper in the entire Middle East, be it Israel-Palestine, be it Iran-Israel, and even in Syria. Like Vladimir Putin, Sergei Lavrov, they are the most neutral, multipolar actors from abroad who come in and just say, look, guys, давайте жить дружно. Like they just speak like Kot Leopold from that Soviet cartoon, the cat, the Jewish cat who really wanted everyone to be at peace. That's exactly what's happening here. They just want love, flowers, and peaceful trade. It's very strange. In the end, unfortunately, I think for Russia, they will have to, in some way, I think, even side with the American and Israeli Kurds, only because you said that Kurdish threat towards Turkey will benefit Russia to some extent. And that's if we're really thinking about this in a hypothetical geopolitical big game sense. The Russians will benefit from a Kurdistan existing because it will weaken Turkey. And in a weakened Turkey, it will mean Russian and potentially future Greek expansion south of the Black Sea. And that, I think, is probably an inevitability if Erdogan falls.
No, and it raises a lot of questions about, we've been speculating a lot about how, of course, the general wisdom, and I think this is what Metropolitan Neophytos is hinting at as well, considering that the prophecies say Turkey will immediately become pro-Western and anti-Russian, and likely also anti-Iranian, because right now Turkey is effectively pro-Iranian with Erdogan. So in theory, again, what I think we would generally say on the show is most likely, what we would, in theory, I guess if we had to pick, say would be the best to happen, and what Metropolitan Neophytos seems to be pointing to here is it will be effectively Russia either neutrally acting or effectively aligned with Iran, China, and some of these other multipolar powers. But what you're hinting at, Dimitri, is potentially you could see Russia allying with the U.S. and Israel and the Kurds somehow as Iran and Turkey work together. But there is also a potential reality where Turkey, who has already turned against the West, or rather against Russia and towards the West, maybe Iran and Russia would help form a Kurdistan that would innately not threaten Iran, maybe imply, a strong Iranian border, potentially even relocate some of the Kurds in Iran to this new independent Kurdistan in Iraq and Syria. So there's a lot of different options and ways that we could game this situation out. Of course, you mentioned the Russian bases in Syria. I mean, the news has been reporting that the Israelis are working hard to prevent the Russians from returning to Syria, that it is all al-Jalani who wants the Russians back to be a buffer against Israeli expansion, because the Israelis this past week made it extremely clear they're basically in Mount Hermon and these other regions of Syria beyond the Golan Heights into the Quneitra province. They're there to stay. They're going to colonize. They're going to put settlers there, and they're going to redraw the map to have that include Israel. So, Israel is, rapidly expanding its borders. And as you said, with all these different possibilities of how Russia could end up, because like you said, Russia, they're the true peacekeepers. They're the true anti-racists. They just love Jews and Persians, everybody all equally, so you can't say that, Putin isn't keeping his word, truly anti-racist, fighting his anti-racist SMO as well, I guess. But the situation there in Syria is undoubtedly something that, even if Russia is no real threat to Israel, their presence at all is viewed as a win for, I guess, the Syrian government, who despite being ostensibly enemies of Russia, have already got themselves back in the good graces of Russia, whereas Israel basically will be threatened by anybody in power in that part of the world until it is a direct satrapy or just directly Israeli territory. If you look at the greater Israel map that Smotrich and these other people love to LARP around with. So very, very interesting times. We're obviously going to be keeping tabs on the Balochi, Pakistan, Iranian border as well, because the Pakistanis are also, we know about the Saudi Arabia-Pakistan defense deal. Apparently Turkey and even Iran itself are very interested in getting this deal. So we're very quickly seeing, within just a few months, the emergence of a Middle Eastern NATO of sorts, an anti-Israel Muslim NATO, which I think not many people would have guessed, considering where Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Pakistan all, relatively speaking, were maybe just a year ago. So very, very interesting developments indeed. If you have any other thoughts on the Middle East, Dimitri, feel free to throw them in here as we move to Venezuela briefly. I know that in Aden, which was previously the capital of the Southern Transition Council, the UAE-backed STC, the separatist group in Yemen. There are enormous protests, pretty big protests in favor of the STC returning to power. Obviously, the leader of the STC fled and is now in exile in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. So they're protesting to have him back because obviously the support of separatism in southern Yemen does have on-the-ground support. The people there, I think, want to control their own destiny, and I guess they don't want to be under Ansar Allah or Saudi influence. So that is a real thing. So the STC, despite the fact that they've disbanded, they might not be fully down for the count yet. But the latest with Venezuela, this is from Anti-War, the U.S. has seized their sixth oil tanker in the Caribbean. According to statements from the U.S. military and U.S. officials, the Trump administration continues its blockade on Venezuela with the goal of controlling the country's oil industry and exports. U.S. Southcom said the Marines and sailors deployed from the aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Ford seized the tanker named Veronica early Thursday morning. The command posted a video showing U.S. forces descending onto the tanker. The Veronica is the latest tanker operating in defiance of President Trump's established quarantine of sanctioned vessels in the Caribbean. That's what Southcom said. It is a Venezuelan-related tanker. I don't know if it was going to Russia or China or Cuba. It's probably where it was headed, I would assume. So the tanker wars continue. Obviously, when things get hot with Iran, there's going to be a lot more tanker seizures. You know, Persian Gulf tankers are usually what we hear about over the years. Every few years, there's a big flare-up between the U.S. and Iran. I mean, what was it, a few years back when Iran seized a tanker and arrested the hundreds of U.S. troops, or rather that were on the tanker, or if it was a U.S. Navy vessel, I forget which. But it was a huge deal, and the Americans, couldn't do anything, and they had our troops for a while. So it was a big diplomatic row that obviously didn't lead to war, but many people were suspecting that it would. But the tanker wars, I think, are undoubtedly going to increase. The waterways, merchant shipping is probably one of the key nodes on top of oil and energy itself. The prices of oil and the passage through the Suez canals and these other places, the flow of other goods on these tankers is equally as important. So that's going to be one of the most important economic factors that we need to watch. And there will undoubtedly, like I said, be a lot more seizures and different potentially even things hitting mines and other things being struck and destroyed as the economic warfare continues. I mean, remember the Lusitania and what happens when there are these international blockades and ships pretending to carry weapons. I mean, we hear all the time about the U.S. interdicting ships on their way to Yemen that the Iranians were using to supply weapons, the Iranians intercepting Mossad shipments into the Gulf and these other things. So undoubtedly, there will be civilians caught up in the crossfire of this high-level trade, economic, clandestine warfare that's going on. But regarding Venezuela and its leadership, Trump said that he will work with remnants of the Maduro regime so Venezuela does not turn into Iraq, which is an interesting comment. As I mentioned earlier, Delcy Rodriguez has met with General CIA Chief Ratcliffe. She's also sent delegations to the United States who have supposedly met with Trump in the immediate aftermath of him meeting with Machado and the opposition regime, who she gave Trump her Nobel Peace Prize, which Trump claims he really wants for himself, which who cares? The Nobel Peace Prize is literally meaningless nonsense. Obama got it for what? And I think what it seems to be is that Rodriguez seems to want to stay in power and collaborate. I don't know if there's going to be a power sharing agreement where Machado comes in as well and works with Delcy. I don't know what Diosdado Cabello and Padrino, the other major power players in Venezuela, are doing. It doesn't seem that they're willing to stand up to Rodriguez. So potentially everybody collaborated against Maduro behind the scenes to make this all happen. At some point, we'll have to do a bit of a retrospective and think exactly how the Maduro capture really went down, the mechanics of it, and how it occurred. I'm sure researchers are already looking in. We could talk to Jose about that the next time we have him on. But it appears that everybody involved right now is trying to keep the peace as best they can after a brief moment of chaos. So briefly, the nothing ever happens Chud lost, but they've quickly picked him back up, sat him back on the throne, and are trying to get things back to the nothing ever happens norm. But it's clear that Trump at least wants to make it clear and present the idea that he is fully in control of Venezuela. And as far as I can tell, Russia and China seem to just be watching it happen from across the Atlantic. But in theory, that means that if anything would strengthen their resolve to not see Iran fall, it would be seeing Venezuela totally ripped from their sphere of influence. At least you would hope, right?
No, of course. And we did see quite harrowing footage of the remains of 32 Cuban soldiers returned to Havana at the Havana airport. And they were, of course, greeted with military honors, etc. So 32 Cubans were confirmed to have been deceased. There's been a lot of, I think, borderline, with all due respect, Candace Owens type reports that, wow, 32 Cubans reduced to ash, because obviously it wasn't their bodies that were carried out, it was their ashes in urns and other boxes. But that's the other thing, is that, well, it's a communist tradition to cremate. Yes, it's anti-European, it's anti-Christian, but that's just the nature of communism. Fidel Castro, Cuba's former president and leader of the revolutionary movement, was himself cremated. So like, just keep that in mind. A lot of the Kremlin communist leaders in Soviet Russia were cremated. Alexei Kosygin, for example, was cremated. Yes, Lenin's mummy, in contradiction, lies in the ziggurat on the Red Square, polluting it with its Talmudic energy. But a lot of these other Soviet leaders, they were well and truly cremated. So cremation, it's not a Russian, it's not a European or a Christian tradition. It is well and truly a Talmudic one, of course, reintroduced with a flare of paganism. And that's what I think we're seeing here. So I don't think these are American laser weapons that were used in Venezuela against the Venezuelans, but an interesting report on weaponry, Conrad. I mean, there's still going to be a big investigation into this, I think, from the Venezuelans themselves, into how their country essentially allowed for a president to be kidnapped. But apparently there was some sort of sonic weaponry used that caused Venezuelans to essentially close their ears. It completely deafened them. So that's quite interesting. So sonic warfare is something we really haven't seen in action in the Russo-Ukrainian front. Overall, I think it draws us, Conrad, into this realization that Venezuela truly has been conquered. The strength, the operation style, it's been over a week, more now, right, since the kidnapping of Maduro, and we saw no proper retaliation. I think everybody's shocked by how effective it was. We saw Brazil essentially secede to all of this. We saw the United Nations Security Council absolutely now focusing on Iran. The entire Venezuela angle has been forgotten, well and truly abandoned in the ghetto somewhere. So, and even this telephone call, unfortunately, by Sergei Lavrov speaking to Delcy Rodriguez, this new acting president of Venezuela, the call was about a commitment of strategic relations between Russia and Venezuela, as if those relations did not exist before. When Russian defense, the whole thing is embarrassing. And yes, the telephone call needed to happen in order for, I guess, relations to be reestablished. To say, look, Russia, has clearly seen what has happened, and it still wants to have a relationship with this new Americanized, America-owned Venezuela. I think that's the call from Lavrov, is just to reinforce that idea. Like, look, yes, this was embarrassing, it was humiliating, but we're still going to work with you, just like we work with the other 150 plus countries we have embassies in. So I think that's the crux of that discussion. It's an admittance in some way that, look, there's really nothing else we can discuss at this point, because, well, the country has lost its sovereignty. That is, Venezuela has. It's a massive betrayal, the scale of which I think we haven't seen for a long time in South America. And that's the trouble, I think, Conrad, of second, third world countries, so to speak, the global South. People can be brought out. American consumerism around the world has increased this capitalistic pull towards being wealthy, spending a lot of money, being capitalistic, being rich. And that, of course, that cultural pull towards corruption, it makes it very easy for then the American regime itself to print dollars and just hand them out to people. So that's the reality. Venezuela, sadly, is a sort of a lost front. But I think last week we did admit an interesting thing in that you notice that Trump did not choose to oust all the other communist leaders in Venezuela. And I think that points towards potentially Trump being unable to do so when he says, we don't want Venezuela to turn into Iraq. I agree, that is a stupid thing for Trump to say. One of the reasons is because Iraq only turned into Iraq after the George Bush 2003 invasion. After the Gulf War, Iraq did not turn into Iraq, so to speak, into a post-apocalyptic wasteland. So it is possible, in fact, to have a partial military operation and then quickly go in, reinforce the country. So Trump's analogy, again, Trump's historical references are typically wrong. In this case, I think it was completely irrelevant. It just shows his weakness. I think he's not actually able to completely de-Madurize, de-Bolivarianize, and de-Chavez Venezuela. That's the thing. Venezuela, I think, is well and truly still in that Chavez mindset. And now they're going to be ruled by a woman who will potentially simmer that down. And that's, I think, the tactic being used here. It's like, okay, we have Machado. She's handed over her Peace Prize. We have Delcy Rodriguez, who is, she's still a Chavismo, but she's a female. So it's clearly somewhat under control. And that's the sad reality, is that it's a controlled sort of opposition in Venezuela now. No doubt Venezuela will still contribute to BRICS. It'll still play that BRICS multipolar role. But just like Brazil, it'll be that BRICS actor who maybe is more on the western side, similar to South Africa. I think that's the particular role that Venezuela is probably going to play in the near future. And most likely when the Maduro show trial does take place, it'll be well and truly forgotten, just like we all forgot the event that took place, which was crazy, where Trump pardoned the Honduras drug dealer who literally trafficked hundreds of kilograms of cocaine and other things into the United States, and Trump just pardons him. Like, this is, on paper, a worse criminal than Maduro ever was in terms of the drug trade, and yet Trump pardons. So the whole thing is arbitrary. And yes, I think, like many analysts correctly put, Conrad, it is another strike, another smashing of the hammer against the monument of international law, and essentially this post-World War II consensus that we've all been living in and we've all sort of been born into. It's just going to be ripped apart, and there's going to be a new world order set up very soon. I don't mean that in the George W. Bush sense. I mean that in the sense that after the Third World War concludes and the hot stages of the war will finish, many countries will want to be on that new United Nations Security Council, right? That new sort of conciliar, Hague-esque place where they will all meet up. It definitely won't be in New York, I'll tell you that much. And one of those countries clearly will be Brazil, that want to be on that new Security Council. One of those countries will be India. India does not have a seat on the Security Council at the UN, not a permanent seat at the moment, and they feel really left out. That's why some of these nations are choosing who they play with very carefully, because they want to be unaffected by the Third World War. They want to come out on top. And I think that's probably the reasons as to why Brazil kind of stayed out of the whole Venezuela thing, because, well, they just don't want to be in a hot conflict in the near future with the United States, despite being close with Russia, China, etc., and being part of BRICS. It's just a self-preservationist logic there.
No, I agree. And look, I mean, I don't think anybody's itching to be closer to Venezuela. Look at the country that's by far the closest to Venezuela and how they're doing. Cuba, I mean, the regime is, the Americans seem to think that it's on its way out, and people have said that for a long time. It would still be interesting and surprising if Cuba does fall, but it wouldn't necessarily be a huge shock per se. I mean, the regime has been weak and the economy is bad, and they can't even keep the lights on, really. And as far as I'm aware, the demographic situation is pretty cooked. Most of the better stock, I guess you could say, of Cubans have all left and come to the United States under the fact that basically any Cuban that flees Cuba and steps foot in American soil immediately becomes a citizen or a safe refugee or whatever, somebody that's not eligible for deportation because of the massive Cuban lobby in Florida. So obviously we're going to be watching Cuba. They're going to be having some energy problems for obvious reasons. I don't know if Nicaragua is going to face similar problems, but it's also an obviously multipolar aligned regime, Noriega and everything going on, Ortega, whatever his name is, in the currently in power in Nicaragua, but he's also a target of U.S. ire, and I'm no fan of him. I'm really no fan of Maduro either, but I just don't think that we can say that what's going on there is really in the interest of the American people. Like you said, Dimitri, there are much worse drug characters than Maduro. Brian Berletic's been pointing out that in the 2025 DEA threat assessment report, their year-end report where they list all the biggest drug issues, where it's coming from, just they fully map out their understanding of the drug threat to the United States. Venezuela is mentioned like a few times. I believe it's mentioned less times than Canada. And Tren de Aragua is listed as a street-level gang. There's no mention of the Venezuelan government, no mention of Nicolas Maduro, no mention of anything like this. So obviously you have Colombia, Mexico, China, Canada, even these other places where many more drugs are coming from. No fentanyl at all is coming from Venezuela. The accusations are about very small amounts of cocaine, which we all know where most of the cocaine comes from, Colombia. Not that Trump is friends with Petro, but Gustavo, but the president over there. But all the drug nonsense is the most obvious. It's the worst pretext ever. It's almost as bad as weapons of mass destruction. It's just that thankfully this hasn't been a full boots on the ground war. And Maduro, most people are indifferent about. Look, like I said, he sung Imagine and is doing all this other dumb stuff. He should be leaning into the fact that his country is socially conservative and against gay marriage and abortion and these other things, but instead he wanted to, play communist. So look how far that gets you, man. You got to be praying in times like that, not, singing liberal mantras. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on Cuba, Venezuela, Dimitri, but we do have to discuss what's going on in Russia, Ukraine, because again, Putin, the Ayatollah, Xi, I don't know about Xi, but maybe Kim Jong-un. These are people that potentially certain characters would like to also pull an operation. I'm forgetting what it was called, even the absolute resolve or something like that, I think, like historic resolve or something like that. The operation that captured Maduro, they would want to do the same to, I think the Ayatollah is probably at the top of the list right now, probably followed closely by Kim Jong-un and potentially Vladimir Putin himself, at least certain characters. So what's the latest on the war there on the front, as it does appear that Russia's advancing in Zaporozhye, Donbass. We're all waiting for that day when we'll hear that Russia has liberated the Svyatogorsk monastery.
No, absolutely. And that's, I think, the front will start off with, because the Svyatogorsk monastery is very close, actually, to the city of Krasny Liman, obviously close to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk as well. But in particular, in Krasny Liman, the Russians, in fact, have been striking at bridges going over the Seversky Donets River, right? So that river flows, one of the key actual rivers in Ukraine, in its eastern portion. It's in fact the same river that's displayed in the 8th hour image of World War Now, the one that flows. If you look at any photograph of the Svyatogorsk Lavra, that's the Seversky Donets. And the Russians have been striking the point of Seversky Donets that flows next to Krasny Liman. They've been hitting it with long-range artillery fire because the Ukrainians have been using those bridges to cross over them. Wow, the Russians are actually striking bridges. That's impressive, because we haven't really seen that across the Dnieper, have we? But look, I'll set criticism aside for a moment as we sort of discuss the show. That just means that Svyatogorsk Lavra well and truly is close to being liberated. Once the Russians push further westwards, I mean, they're still within that 10-kilometer range. So what, 7-8 miles away from the Lavra? The Lavra itself is a very convenient, I mean, consider that most of eastern Ukraine is, yes, if in some places very hilly, but mainly flatlands, especially places like Gulai Polye, Zaporozhye. Those locations around Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Svyatogorsk, Lavra, they do offer strategic strategic locations for defending, because the hillsides of Svyatogorsk, Lavra are very steep and quite actually comfortable to use as natural defensive formations. Now, we, of course, wouldn't want either side to use the Svyatogorsk Lavra as some sort of base of operations, so hopefully that will be avoided. If the Russians dare even do that, that will be, of course, a huge strike against their reputation as defenders of the Christians, especially with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So we're hoping that those sort of excesses won't be met. The Russians actually, in other places around the Donetsk Oblast, are pushing very constructively into areas like such as Konstantinovka, that major city from the south. So they're really approaching, they're hitting Svyatogorsk, Kramatorsk, and Slavyansk direction from, of course, the northeast, from Krasny Liman, from Seversk, which they've captured. Actually, Seversk is already confirmed to be captured. They're striking at it from the southeast, that is the Konstantinovka direction. And of course, Konstantinovka itself is well and truly one of the cities that the fighting is taking place in. So you have Radinskaya, Mirnograd has apparently already fallen, which no one's really even discussing, and the Ukrainians have in fact surrendered. Notice no official surrender order has come from the top of the Ukrainian leadership. The Russians had to have local commanders like corporals, generals, sergeants, lieutenants, etc., in Mirnograd surrender piecemeal, like step by step. It's very sad because that led to excessive Ukrainian deaths, but that is the evil that is the Ukrainian high command in Syrsky and the way they do war. They literally, imagine your army is surrounded and you don't offer that surrender option to them. You just tell them to stay there and die, which is completely insane. In Mirnograd, which is so far away from the Ukrainian defensive positions and so isolated. Just a very sad reality that took place there. Obviously, Pokrovsk well and truly taken. The Russians are, now we have a report from the Minister of Defense himself. So I'm just going to quote him. He said, this week, Kupiansk has been taken by the Russians, and the Russians are cleaning up Kupiansk. So when we discussed the Russians actually defending Kupiansk, they're holding the center, fighting off waves of Ukrainians, and some of these Ukrainians are attacking not in like waves as you see in the movies where hundreds, thousands of people are running forward in a group. No, they were striking with small attack forces, like 4 or 5 troops going from building to building, things like that. Those sort of squad attacks, that's been more or less cleaned up. Now the Russians are going from suburb to suburb in Kupiansk, slowly but surely, under constant drone attacks and under constant threats of booby traps, more or less suicidal Ukrainian, maybe some radicals hiding in the basements, willing to blow themselves up along with the Russian attackers that enter into these buildings. It's very dangerous clearing out these sort of basements. I mean, I don't doubt that the majority of American losses in Iraq were, took place by those mines and all kinds of other explosive installations. So keep in mind, Kupiansk is well and truly at the moment one of these like hot zones that the Russians are trying to clean up before they move on. Kupiansk, of course, leads me to the positive view that, look, well, the Russians have taken Volchansk recently. It's been announced in the north of Kharkov. Now that they can Kupiansk, what's next? Now, next we have a clear road towards Kharkov, one of the biggest cities, the second largest city in all of Ukraine, and so close to Belgorod. So that may be the next target. The reason I say this is because which city at the moment, besides Donetsk, has been affected the most by the SMO? Obviously, not Kursk. The Kursk Oblast will set that aside, but the city of Belgorod, which is just, it's less than 50 kilometers away. I think it's 40 kilometers away from Kharkov, just across the border. The Belgorodskaya Oblast, defined by the name of the capital, Belgorod. And Belgorod has experienced probably, as I said early in the episode, it's the worst winter in 150 years. There's been a power outage because the Ukrainians have been drone striking Russian energy facilities there, shutting them down. Heating in apartment buildings is being shut down. It's actually, the crisis is extreme. I would say more extreme than the summer of 2025 drought, which took place in the Lugansk and Donetsk, that I think, Conrad, you experienced to some extent, like the tail end of that drought. And now you having a heating crisis in Belgorod. There's a lot of local complaints. We have to just pray for the Christians there. It's a really tough time. In fact, the Bishop of Belgorod has been well and truly sort of one of the leading appropriate bishops in Russia, who's actually been given quite good sermons throughout the entire special military operation. And I'm sure the church in Belgorod is providing as much help as possible to the local people. But this is just the reality of existing on the front lines of the SMO. One of the reasons why it's quite triggering when you do see people inside like Moscow, St. Petersburg, cities which are so far away from the front lines, complain that one drone has reached Tverskaya Oblast, one drone has reached St. Petersburg. What about the people living in Belgorod who are constantly being bombed? The people in Donetsk, there is no difference between a Russian living in Moscow and a Russian living in Belgorod. Both are Russian citizens, both deserve protection from external forces. There's no excuse if, again, this whole, 91 drones hit Putin's house. Why is Putin's house more important than a tall apartment building in Belgorod being hit by drones constantly and being unpowered during the winter? Like, reality check. So again, this exaggeration, the hyping up of certain strikes within Russia, and then of course the lowering of, it's just Belgorod, don't worry about it. It's just an outskirts, it's the countryside, let them get smashed, let them get bombed. And then they use this excuse in order to not escalate the war in Ukraine. And by escalate, I don't mean send thousands of people to their deaths, but actually strike strategic targets, strategic decision-making centers with missiles such as the Oreshnik. In particular, we note that not a single member of the Ukrainian parliament, Verkhovnaya Rada, has to date, and this war has now, at this point in the episode, Conrad, just this week, it's actually surpassed the duration of the Great Patriotic War, so World War II in Russia's case. So it's now longer than the Second World War, since the beginning of Operation Barbarossa on the 22nd of June, 1941. So that's impressive. That is well and truly interesting, I think, to say the very least. And the war's going to keep going because a ceasefire or a peace deal for Russia at the moment, I agree with Igor Strelkov, is detrimental to Russian interests because we're too far in. It's not a gambler's fallacy. It's the reality is Russia is overinvested into this conflict, and a premature ceasefire will only result in more bloodshed in the future once Ukraine regains itself, begins producing planes, drones, and all kinds of other equipment, and receives more aid from the West, which is not stopping anytime soon. But just the interesting, I think, foundationally on the map, Russia's pushing well and truly across on every single angle. And at the same time, we do have a final retaliation for the strike on, I don't know if it's on Putin's house, if it's from, the oil tankers being seized. Not sure what the retaliation is about, or maybe it's just a strategic strike of sorts because, well, it actually hit an important target, right? The Russian, of course, claim is that the Oreshnik missile strike, and this is the second use of the Oreshnik in military history, has flown all the way from Kapustin Yar, which is located in the north of the Caspian Sea. So think about it. This is huge distance. Kapustin Yar is the Russian base located all the way out there. And I wouldn't say Siberia, but definitely like close to central Russia, flew all the way west across all of Ukraine, across the entire SMO zone, and struck on the outskirts of Lvov, a factory which, and I'm using the Russian Ministry of Defense's statement on this, it struck a aircraft repair site, essentially a production workshop which created not just Ukrainian drones, but also repaired F-16s, MiG-29s, and other aircraft aviation facility. So it's just very curious that the initial reports about this kind of were completely ignorant, just absolutely like insane. So the Adeshnik strike took place, and it was on the outskirts of Lvov. So we had long-range footage from mobile phones about the Adeshnik looking like something out of the Greek mythology, like Zeus's thunderbolts, like striking out of the sky. Huge light show. I encourage everyone to have a look at that, because that's what high-end modern missiles really do look like. Absolutely apocalyptic, right? In some way, supernatural even. And because they take place at nighttime or at dusk or at twilight, it does appear very impressive. Obviously, a huge light show, very scary. And people were first reporting, I mean, in a fake news type aspect, Conrad, that, they strike a huge gas hub in Western Ukraine, like complete ignorance. Like, why would, so the Russians are not striking infrastructure and these gas holding pipelines, right? The one like went through Sudzha and Kursk for the same reason, because this gas is meant for some of Russia's allies in Central Eastern Europe, such as Hungary, Slovakia, etc. Like, why would Russia strike gas infrastructure? How ignorant do you have to be? In fact, gas has been one of those no-go zones for the Russians. They've been avoiding striking, active gas pipelines the entire war. And suddenly people are claiming, well, it's to degasify Ukraine. I mean, how stupid. So this is why it's a good point is just once these stories do hit, sometimes it's a good idea to wait a few days or a few hours to actually find out what the Russians actually struck in the first place. Now, the reason I mentioned decision-making centers is because guess what? Zelensky told us that the Adeshnik strike was coming a few hours before it actually struck, which means that in Kapustin Yar, in fact, Zelensky has mentioned it, and I think the American newspapers also, news media sources published the fact that an Adeshnik strike was incoming, like hours before the actual missiles hit, which means that the West has spies, Ukrainians have spies in Kapustin Yar or in Moscow, or whomever, orchestrated this massive attack, which was a success in the end, but still, can that be looked into, please, from the Russian perspective? The other interesting aspect of the Adeshnik strike, Conrad, is that, I mean, again, Western sources told us, and Zelensky himself said that the strikes came not from a missile silo from the ground, not like one of those tubes in the ground, the hole. It actually came from a portable device. So now it makes us think, maybe it's like an Iskander missile. It can be lodged onto the back of an 8-wheeler truck, and the Adeshnik can be, in fact, portable, which means then it can definitely be sold to other countries, like in a portable form, like to Iran. And an Adeshnik from Iran could most definitely comfortably hit Israel. So there's all kinds of perspective information going around about the Adeshnik, but I think it should be used more, and it should be used more against, again, these very tactical zones. Now, I'll mention one more thing about the Ukrainian conflict at the moment, because this winter is very cold. You do see all kinds of PR footage from the mayor of Kiev, for example, Klitschko, right, the brothel owner of Ukraine, the former heavyweight boxing champion. He's been posting all this footage of him trying to defrostify these pipes and trying to repair Ukrainian apartment buildings in the city of which he is a mayor, in Kiev. It's been reported by the Reznikov, the former defense minister of Ukraine, that 137 apartment buildings, these are tall Soviet-era apartment buildings with really good insulation, technically they're very conservative buildings, right? They're all depowered, 137 buildings. So there's tens of thousands of Ukrainians without power and energy. But you can bet that the richest, most Talmudic, most corrupt Ukrainians that have killed the most people, according to the decisions, are sitting warm in their homes. So these strikes against energy hubs across Ukraine, their aim, I believe, is most likely to frustrate the average Ukrainians to rise up against their government, similar to how Israel was also striking Iran, but hoping at the same time via Netanyahu's videos for the Iranian people to lash out against their leadership. Now, I'm not sure how effective that strategy is, I'll be completely honest, because it hasn't worked in Ukraine to date. And the only people suffering from these energy bombardments in Ukraine, instead of, say, bombing Zelensky's house, or bombing some of these, the Verkhovna Rada, or the headquarters of the SBU, like instead of hitting the power plant, hit that. And what we're seeing is the regular Ukrainians, it's not just my opinion, it's the opinion of other people, respectable geopolitical analysts like Maxim Kalashnikov, who is from Odessa himself. He was born and raised in Odessa, Soviet Ukraine. And he says, well, why are regular Ukrainians suffering, but the richest, most decision-making Ukrainians who are actually involved, and they are mainly responsible, are obviously living in their underground bunkers or these powerfully defended apartment buildings in Ukraine, completely defended and fine. They have electricity. It's the regular citizens of Ukraine, regular Slavic, brainwashed Russians who are now suffering in Ukraine. And that's, again, raises questions as to the effectiveness of this entire thing. If not for the Russian progression, Conrad, this entire operation, at least at this point in 2026, would look somewhat pathetic. But we do see a huge, of course, push by the Russians westward. And that reinforces our idea that, look, minus a new mobilization, the Russians are, in fact, progressing at a positive pace. So these drone strikes, these Iskander strikes, even the Ereshnik strike, they're being combined with, of course, a Russian push towards liberating some of these key territories. And that, I think, is what makes all of this worthwhile to some extent. But yeah, it's not exactly a clear-cut war, which I think we have to discuss somewhat symmetrically. There are these issues, and the conduct of certain sides do need to be, I think, broken down in detail. But it is curious. The Russians said that the Ereshnik strike was not a retaliation. It wasn't a retaliation for the ships being seized. It wasn't a retaliation of the attack on Putin's house. As many of these interesting, I'm not sure what to call them, but let's just call them like false Z propagandists, because in fact, many of them do not care about Russia. They don't care about orthodoxy. They're uncatechized. All they care about is like just spreading weird propaganda online. And even Ukrainians themselves, they claimed, oh, this is a retaliation for an attack on Putin's house. No, it was a strategic strike on an aviation repair factory and a drone production facility in Western Ukraine. That's all it was. And it was correct. So people need to really sort of rethink about how they see the Ukrainian conflict and how exactly the regular people are suffering on both sides of it. What Belgorod, including some of the people in Kiev as well. Just a few thoughts on that subject, because we rarely discuss the fates of regular civilians who are caught, between two big superpowers at this point. And by superpowers, I mean all of Europe backing Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah, seeing the Ereshnik footage is always interesting. It's, you can see it because nothing else you've ever seen moves that fast besides like, I don't know, like a lightning strike or something else. So it's always very interesting to see when it's deployed. But as far as other, frontline updates out of Ukraine, we've had reports that over 200,000 soldiers, this has been admitted by the Minister of Defense, Fedorov. He said, the Ministry of Defense is coming into my hands with a $6.7 million shortfall, 2 million Ukrainians who are wanted and 200,000 who are AWOL. Ukrainska Pravda reported that the number of desertions is significantly higher, nearly 300,000. So they have, 300,000 people who have, if they fled Ukraine to Russia, to Belarus, or to other places, or they're in hiding somewhere in Ukraine. That's, that's a large number of people that the Ukrainians, in theory, need fighting and defending. At a certain level, they're conscripting every male over 25. Many people I know that are between 18 and 22 have fled. So even if they do have to start dipping underneath and recruiting more people from that younger age bracket, a lot of those people have already left. So at a certain level, they're going to reach the bottom of the barrel of people they can reasonably expect to actually face intense combat at the front line with this intense, drone level warfare and everything else. So that's a fascinating update. But as far as the negotiations go, Trump recently has been blaming Zelensky for the negotiations falling through. I think in reality, Trump is just much more focused on the Middle East right now as they're preparing for likely war with Iran. So hopefully the Russians know that they can probably get a few things past the goalie, as it were, and do some things in Ukraine that might not get as much of a response. But before we move on to discussing Greenland and some of these other major issues from this past week, Dimitri, do you have any thoughts on the status of negotiations, what might be coming? Obviously, we know Turkey, I think, recently, Strelkov, his assessment did see that the Ukrainians are probably going to likely be trying to bring Poland, Romania, Turkey, potentially these other immediate parties to the theater of conflict into the war itself. I don't know if you have any thoughts on the future status of negotiations, but they do seem to be completely stagnating, and I think the Russians want it that way as far as I can tell.
Well, yeah, that's right. And negotiations, I agree with Igor Strelkov's analysis is that ceasefire, peace talk right now will completely sort of stagnate the Russian victory that has been sort of now rolling out in full force across the entire front line. But there is a little bit of an update. Notice Medinsky, Umerov completely sidelined. Like those Ankara-Istanbul talks have been completely frozen. It doesn't seem like both sides are communicating with one another. That is the teams that we saw respectively sitting on either side of the table with obviously the Turkish foreign minister and Erdogan in the center. That's been completely, swept under the rug, removed, archived. Very strange. At the same time, what hasn't been removed, Conrad, is the Talmudic angle of the entire thing, which I think our audience will find very interesting. We have Witkoff and Kushner. This report from the 14th of January, 2026. They've apparently they seek to visit Moscow to see Putin again. And it's like, well, of course, Chabad Lubavitch, like who else? I mean, who else could bring peace between Russia and Ukraine if not the Chabadniki, which now they're traveling to the Third Rome once again into the Kremlin. They're going to not take off their top hats. I mean, the rabbis, that is, but Witkoff and Kushner will be speaking to Putin. I'm not sure if Kushner can speak Russian, but Witkoff certainly can. And they'll be discussing some sort of prospects there. It's very curious. But Trump, yeah, absolutely, is blaming Zelensky personally. And that's probably because Zelensky is seeing the recent purges within Ukraine, like the changes in administration, the appointment of Budanov. I think Zelensky is gaining some sort of, some sort of traction. Is maybe has a more of a grip on power now that he's moving chess pieces around within his own government. And obviously, the whole Nabu investigation. Now they're looking at actually investigating Timoshenko. So some of the political and Poroshenko as well being investigated. There's people who are in opposition to Zelensky that are being investigated by these American-based anti-corruption agencies within Ukraine. So Zelensky's he's quite happy actually, because even if there will be an election in Ukraine, let's say announced for the end of 2026, for example, most likely Zelensky will be not contending against some of those powerful former Ukrainian big politicians who we saw, of course, dominate Ukrainian politics in the early 2000s, because a lot of them now are being their reputations being damaged by apparent corruption charges. And that being said, Zelensky, of course, the cocaine sniffer, is probably the most corruptive out of all of them, which is, of course, paints all of this with a certain color of irony. And it is very curious that throughout all of this, Conrad, we do have President Putin leaning into the fact that, look, and this is for the entire December 2025, I think President Putin spoke about 4 or 5 times on the subject of the war in Ukraine. He said definitively his message across the board, and this is the updated message status on the Russo-Ukrainian SMO conflict, is that if Russia cannot achieve what it wishes to achieve via negotiations, it will do so by military means. That is now the status quo. That is the position of Russia. It's not amorphous. It's not ambiguous. That's just what the Russian take is. So if Russia cannot liberate its constitutional zones, Zaporozhye, Kherson, Donetsk, Lugansk, and completely halt Ukrainian attacks on those areas, including Crimea, and push all of the Ukrainians out of its constitutional zones, then they will achieve that by military means. That's all basically Putin said. The question about Energodar, Zaporozhye nuclear power plant located therein, just outside of that town, all of that, I think, is extra sort of the cherry on top of the cake. At the moment, President Putin, I think, is quite happy about the military success. And we saw this, of course, in his Christmas liturgy, when he attended the Christmas liturgy with, again, families of veterans. And after the liturgy, President Putin himself gave a sermon. And I just have to call it what it is. He basically stepped down just below the Amvon and spoke to some of the children of the veterans and the veterans themselves and their wives, mothers. And he said, look, the Russian soldiers are doing a very important thing. They're giving their life for their loved ones, for their neighbors, which is what Christ commanded. So Putin, actually, we have him quoting our Lord and Savior, which is, I'm quite fond of that, because it doesn't happen very often. So Putin did give a very nice sort of Christmas sermon on the 7th of January, which was, I think, refreshing. So in any case, we can kind of see exactly what direction Russia's actions in the Middle East. There's still a big question mark on that. How Russia exactly responds long-term to Venezuela, big questions about that. But Russia's position in Ukraine is, I think, at this point, very, very clear to us. So that's good. At least there's some understanding in what will come next. And I think there's no mystery that Zelensky will continue to throw bodies at this thing until there's none left.
Yeah, I think whether Zelensky stays in power to the end or not I wouldn't be surprised if he does, but, maybe they'll swap him out for somebody else. We know that, Zaluzhny is out, a lot of these other characters have been cycled through. So maybe Zelensky's in it for the long haul. I guess we'll see. But we got to move on here to the old United States. But I think the biggest story, obviously domestically, is all this ICE stuff, which we'll talk about in a second. But, speaking of ICE, the literal sense, we have Greenland on the table here, a very icy place. And Trump, he's been threatening tariffs. He's been talking about the military option. There's been a lot of threats. Recently, the European Union, NATO, a combined force of, German, Finnish, French troops. They deployed 13 soldiers to Greenland, to heartily defend against a U.S. invasion. This is from Al Jazeera. It says, U.S. President Donald Trump says he may impose tariffs on countries that do not back the U.S. claim to control Greenland. A message that came as a bipartisan congressional delegation sought to lower tensions in the Danish capital. Since Trump returned to the White House in January, he's repeatedly insisted that the U.S. control Greenland, a semi-autonomous territory of NATO ally Denmark, and said earlier this week that anything less than the Arctic island being in U.S. hands would be unacceptable. During an unrelated event at the White House about rural health care, he recounted how on Friday he had threatened European allies with tariffs on pharmaceuticals. I may do that for Greenland too, Trump said. I may put a tariff on countries if they don't go along with Greenland, because we need Greenland for national security, so I may do that. We need Greenland for national security very badly. If we don't have it, we have a big hole in national security, especially when it comes to what we're doing in terms of the Golden Dome, he told reporters, which, if you don't know, that is the Trump version of the Iron Dome in Israel that he wants to do in America. The head of Denmark's Joint Arctic Command in Greenland told Reuters on Friday he's focused on countering potential Russian activity, not defending against U.S. military threats. My focus is not toward the U.S. at all. My focus is on Russia, Major General Soren Andersen said on board a Danish warship in Nuuk, Greenland's capital. Andersen dismissed suggestions of conflict between NATO allies, describing such a scenario as hypothetical. I don't see a NATO ally attacking another NATO ally, he said, referring to Denmark's defense plans. And it's true that ultimately, I think if America wants it, they'll get it. If the Danes actually think America is going to invade and that the fabric of NATO is at risk, I think they'll just take whatever monetary offer or whatever that the U.S. has on the table and just sort of be done with it. Because ultimately, the U.S. has propositioned for Greenland before. At the time they bought Alaska, they were looking at Greenland. The time that they acquired the Danish East Indies, or the Danish West Indies, obviously, in the Caribbean, which are now the U.S. Virgin Islands. At that same time, they were asking potentially for deals on Greenland from Denmark. So it's not an unheard of concept. And again, if NATO controls it and the U.S. is, the most powerful army in NATO, and continentally it's connected to North America, at a certain level, the Danes' argument for not allowing the Americans to completely control it sort of goes out the window. Frankly, I think your best argument is probably environmental claims, because the U.S. are probably going to develop as much of it as they can and look for natural resources and not care at all about the natural beauty or this, that. So, the Europeans, they know a whole lot about environmentalism. They should probably lean into it if they want to keep Greenland. But I think within the next few years, potentially before the end of Trump's term, it's very likely that we see Greenland enter the United States' hands, or some kind of new agreement, some major agreement that basically gives the U.S. the ability to do whatever they want in Greenland is signed. So I'm very interested in how all of that is going to go. I have been to the U.S. Virgin Islands. I learned about the Danish history there. Very interesting that the Danes, I think the Swedes, many of these smaller countries had very small empires in the West Indies, and the Germans had their small holdings in Africa and stuff. So very interesting things to look into. But the Europeans, they really don't like this. There have been certain parties are threatening that, we should break up NATO. Certain people are wanting, this whole thing is making certain European countries want to discuss breaking away from U.S. influence, not from a Eurosceptic, nationalist perspective like the AFD, but I guess from a libtarded perspective or something. Macron, I guess, is probably the strongest Eurocrat leader that would want to lead a united Europe. He said, we don't underestimate statements on Greenland. If the sovereignty of a European and allied state was hit, the knock-on effects would be unprecedented. France is following the situation with the utmost attention and will act in full solidarity with Denmark. So I don't know, Macron is like, we need to unite as a European army to fight the United States. I don't know if that's, I don't even know what to think of that. Is that, would Richard Spencer support that? We have to call him, because he's the final word on that. Him and Gunther Fellinger can tell us what to think about a European army to fight the United States. But do you have any thoughts on the Greenland situation, Dimitri? Obviously, it directly concerns Russia and China. Russia is obviously far more advanced than the U.S. in weaponized icebreakers and these other necessities for Arctic warfare. So what are your thoughts on the Greenland developments? It does seem that most people didn't take it seriously at first, but it seems it is very serious indeed.
No, of course. I think the only disclaimer that I'll give is that any development up there in the Arctic is well and truly like a costly endeavor, both for the Russians, which have been doing it sort of, again, slowly pacing themselves, or Rosatom developing LNG factories, as we discussed in our BRICS and Russian energy Ukraine episode. When the Russians do develop these things, they take a long time and they're very costly. Like even extracting all those minerals from the ground is even much more expensive than Venezuela. So to do that in the Arctic, around Greenland, in those waters, or on mainland Greenland itself, it's going to be a very long-term project. If anything, this is an investment for the long future, right? Which is Trump, I guess, wants to secure his legacy as the 45th and then 47th president of the United States, as this man just similar to the president who purchased Alaska off of Russia. A really good analogy, Conrad. So in the long term, this may be a huge strategic asset, but in the short term, especially with the costly, hot phase of World War III that's about to commence, and with the potential closing of the Straits of Hormuz, the sanctions, etc. It's not very likely that we're going to see a development of Greenland to its fullest extent in even in our entire lifetimes, because this is something that will be a future project. And in fact, that it's well and truly up to question, especially given the de-whitification of the United States, the brownification of it, if the United States will even exist by the time Greenland is ready to go, so to speak, and the country actually serves its purpose. What's the point of all these overseas, colonial holdings if there's no actual national American population to reinforce them and to benefit from them? So that's a really big question mark, similar to, I guess, American taking of certain Canadian provinces in the future. But generally speaking, Denmark, unfortunately, has really shown itself as a weapon of the Talmudic powers ever since they essentially put Nicholas II's mother, Maria Fyodorovna, under house arrest when she returned from the Russian Revolutionary Bolshevik-owned Russian Empire. She was then essentially silenced by the rest of the Danish royal family and essentially held in this sort of house arrest type status until her passing. So keep that in mind. Denmark has been well and truly not an ally of Christians for a long time. So I'm not really lamenting the Danish loss of the Greenland as some sort of privation of human rights or national sovereignty. The other big aspect to all of this, Conrad, is again the status of NATO. If NATO falls apart because of the Turkey-Greek thing or because of the Ukrainian thing, or maybe both of them at the same time taking place, right? These are the two big crisis events. If NATO does collapse, yeah, there should be nothing holding back America from engaging in Greenland, which at the moment they're sort of poised towards. And I want to know the person who whispered this Greenland idea into Trump's ear, because clearly he himself did not have it, but somebody knew the history of Greenland acquisition or the America's attempts to do so, and actually pointed this out to Trump. And now it's completely become one of the key points of his second term. So it'll be interesting to see where all of that goes.
Yeah, we even saw Mark Carney of Canada, reasserting to journalists that, if Denmark and Greenland have just invaded, obviously the decision regarding Greenland is solely up to the Greenlanders and the Kingdom of Denmark. And if they're invaded, then all of our NATO agreements stand, including, Article 5. And it's like, boy, so Canada is going to fight the United States for Greenland. Now, I'm sure that will deter Donald Trump, right? But I thought that was funny. But yeah, it's an interesting thing to follow. I think it's funny. I'm not, again, it's one of those things like with the Venezuela thing. I'm not inherently against it. In theory, it would make sense. Greenland is in our hemisphere of interest. It's continentally part of North America, which I think the United States, the American nation, has the right to have sovereignty over. But as of right now, it's exclusively being used. That will ultimately to help foment a war that would pit, white American people against white Russian people. So I can't necessarily say that just because that empire, bears the American flag that represents my ethnic group of, Anglo-Americans, I can't endorse the action because the action is not being carried out in the interests of said nation. So I can't say I endorse it right now, even if under a different regime, under a different context, it might not be particularly egregious. But the other domestic story we have to talk about is, Trump threatened to, invoke the Insurrection Act, which, again, my perspective on that is if you're going to threaten invoking the Insurrection Act, you really need to be ready to actually do it, because Trump has threatened this several times and it never happens. So eventually the threat just completely rings hollow, much like what's the saying about a Chinese warning about how they're endless and continue to happen or whatever. China has issued its final warning, meaning that there will be 300 more warnings before Taiwan is reunited, right? But if Trump doesn't actually use the Insurrection Act and these people continue in Minneapolis and even Chicago and other cities to just attack ICE officers and interfere with immigration investigations. Right now, everybody's protesting and getting mad about this illegal immigrant that was detained by ICE and I guess was somehow strangled. He's, George Floyd, whatever the Hispanic version of George Floyd is. He's that, I guess. But it came out that he's like a child rapist. So it's not really, I don't think he's somebody that a lot of people are ultimately going to want to come to bat for. I guess he raped a child under the age of 11 or something. So I don't think anyone really cares that this guy was detained and happened to be strangled by law enforcement. I'm certainly not losing any sleep over it. And I guess people want us to comment on the whatever her name is, Renee Good. But look, nobody likes seeing anybody die, but she put herself in that situation. She interfered with a law enforcement investigation and ran her car into a law enforcement officer, and she got killed for it. It's unfortunate, maybe things could have gone differently, but these people need to realize, and that's why I think Trump should put the Insurrection Act in place, and anybody interfering should receive the maximum sentence. That's the only way you're going to deter people from interfering in these law enforcement investigations. Do you think in Russia, people F around like this? No, like nobody would dare, like if someone saw an FSB operation or a domestic police operation or a mass deportation operation that like happens very frequently in Russia, you think some random Russian libtards that see that are like, I'm going to interfere with this operation. There are plenty of libtards in Russia, and many of them might even be in the vicinity of these operations, but they certainly wouldn't think to do such a thing for obvious reasons, because they would get put in prison for a very long time. So Trump needs to maybe take a handbook out of Putin, take a page out of Putin's playbook, as it were, and make sure these people realize that this isn't a game. Because right now, if these people aren't facing any consequences, we got Will Stancil on Twitter posting about intercepting ICE convoys with his Honda Fit and like tracking them on Twitter. Like these people need to be like understand that this is not something that's okay. But until that happens, law and order is never going to be restored.
No, I completely agree. And look, I somewhat have to contend with the fact that these operations, these deportations, isn't that kind of what right-wingers voted for in the first place, like deportation of Somalis, illegals, and Somalian fraudsters, etc. Yes, on one hand, you have to understand, like Talmudic Jewry Palantir is going to take a piece of this pie and consume it itself, or somehow develop their further control of society. But in the short term, well and truly, I think in the short term, having less of these, essentially illegal migrants and people who break the law will, I think, benefit Native American peoples, white Americans, firstly, in the long term. And this is just, I think there's the inevitability. So the deportation of all these illegals, the investigation of the fraud, it's always tactical. The example, Conrad, is very clearly the pointing out of the fraud of the Somalis, right? Is that happens literally at the same time as Somaliland is being recognized by Israel. Like, clearly these two events are connected, but are the fraudsters real? Yes. And so it's just a tactical law enforcement operation. And we see now, I think this is also to bolster Trump's internal domestic, the ICE operations, right? The MAGA crowd is well and truly behind them. And this is to bolster Trump's, I think, strong position domestically in America as somebody who carries out and who does what he promises, at least to, some minor extent, before some major foreign political operation takes place. So we can then say, well, look, we have to get behind Trump on this Iran thing because he's kept his promises thus far. I'm sure it was no different in many other countries around the world, but this is something that I think you can trace back and logically route out. And yes, it is sad that some of these protesters are so enraged and so brainwashed that they actually put themselves, they lived in this cozy Reddit bubble for so long, Conrad, and now they think they can get in front of police officers and stop them, like with their vehicles. This wouldn't be allowed in any, and for those multipolarists who are now opposing it, right? This wouldn't be allowed in any multipolar country. Imagine this being done in Xi Jinping's China. Like, excuse me, do you remember the Hong Kong protests? I mean, there's hundreds of people just disappeared, never to be heard from again. No trial, nothing. It's like, this is, so let's just not be hypocrites like the crazy Americans and Israelis who use this sort of double speak, double logic with Iran, right? Well, let's just call it what it is. These are law enforcement operations. And I think, yes, inevitably there will be some sort of lessons learned from, it's like, okay, like the FEMA camps that Alex Jones spoke about back in the day, yes, they are taking notes on how exactly to corral and how exactly to control domestic populations in America. But this operation is not against white Americans in and of itself inherently. That may be a collateral result in going down some information obtained from how this is done. Similar to how COVID itself wasn't an actual pandemic, but it was a huge info gathering operation, which now they know exactly how people will react when an actual pandemic takes place around the world. So we have to just put these things into context and perspective.
Yeah, I don't know if the libtard protests will ever get to anything akin to George Floyd levels or anything like that again, but I guess we'll see if, more of these episodes where immigrants or affluent white female liberals protesting get got, as it were. Maybe the protests will increase, but regardless, the deportations must dramatically increase for any of this to be worth it. So I think that's what we can all take away from this. But moving on to church news, we'll discuss the Church persecution in Ukraine, as we often do near the end of the episode here. This is from Ortho Christian. Says His Eminence Metropolitan Vladimir Volinsky and Koval has issued an appeal to the leadership of the Security Service of Ukraine and the National Police of Ukraine in the Volyn province regarding the persecution of clergy and church servants in his diocese. The Metropolitan states that clergy from his diocese have been detained, with some ceasing communication afterwards and their fate remaining unknown. He specifically cites an incident on January 14th in which a sexton of the Holy Dormition Cathedral was beaten and abducted near his home by unknown persons who identified themselves as representatives of law enforcement agencies. Metropolitan Vladimir calls on authorities to act according to their oath to the Ukrainian people and requests urgent intervention and restoration of justice. I don't know if you know much about this specific story, Dimitri, but obviously I think most bishops under the Ukrainian Orthodox Church would be able to file similar complaints to the Ukrainians and the government about disappearances and, forced recruitment and other such things.
Oh no, of course, especially someone from like the Bishop of Volyn, that's so far west Ukraine next to Lvov. It's, well and truly, it needs to begin now, especially those Western Ukrainian clergymen, dioceses, laypersons, because if some sort of crazy ceasefire or peace deal is struck, those Western provinces will be isolated from their mother church, the Moscow Patriarchate. And so you have to understand they're going to be in isolation. They're going to have to deal with the losers and essentially, well, people who've persecuted them leading in a civil, secular sense, their particular provinces and whatever country Ukraine turns into in the aftermath. If there is a piece of it that remains autonomous, like these bishops will be living under that particular regime. And so now they need to actually adjust, and now they're acting and actually filing these complaints in appropriate, not some sort of crazy pro-Russian way. They're being as neutral as possible. So this is exactly correct, in order to retain religious autonomy, especially for the Ukrainian Orthodox canonical church. Another interesting thing took place in Ukraine. There's been a monastery which runs essentially a Ukrainian Saturday, Sunday school for young students, right? Essentially like tutoring classes. They teach them about the Bible, scripture, etc. But they also teach them other subjects, which unfortunately, maybe the kids need that extra support. And the textbooks they use, so they teach them the Russian language, which again, this monastery, Golosevsk, it's located in a particular place where I think Russian language at the moment is being suppressed. I'll need to double check, but for whatever reason, the children do learn. They have extra Russian tutoring lessons at this monastery, being taught by the monks and clergymen there. This was raided by Ukrainian SBU and police, and this particular monastery was shut down. And when they looked at the textbooks of the students, they said, wow, these math textbooks were printed in the Soviet Union. They are communist textbooks. It's like, it's mathematics, okay? Like, it doesn't matter who printed it, like Fidel Castro or Obama. Like, it's probably going to be the same thing. And the other thing they really picked on is the Russian language textbooks, just teaching you basic Russian grammar, as if Russian as a language isn't used in Ukraine. How absolutely racist, from that sort of anti-Russophobic extent that the Ukrainians are really pushing this. And the reason why I mentioned the churches, well, obviously it was a monastery that was raided, but also the former hierarch of the UOC. So this is the former, he held a really high position. Now is in the OCU, Alexander Drabinko, this guy who hates canonical orthodoxy. He's a bishop now. He has a very short beard. You can tell by his physiognomy that he's essentially this schismatic. He goes on an interview and he says, look, it's correct that this monastery got raided. We have to shut these things down. These are like Vatnik textbooks, they belong to like these evil Russians. This sort of stuff needs to be shut down. It doesn't matter that it's a monastery. And especially these kids, children witnessing police operations in general is just not a good thing. So the whole thing was, again, another dramatic act by the Ukrainian state, like overusing its policing faculties. And look, this next story is probably the biggest shocker of the week, Conrad. I think we would all agree. So the Russian Foreign Intelligence Agency, literally not the FSB, but essentially the SVR. So this is the Russian spy agency. Call it the Russian MI6. Led by Sergei Naryshkin, released a very interesting press conference statement, essentially. It's quite short, several paragraphs, but in the statement, they critique Patriarch Bartholomew, the ecumenical patriarch based out of Istanbul, his position on Ukraine, promoting the schism there, but especially promoting the schism in the Baltics, that is Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, which, yes, in fact, the ecumenical patriarchate has been doing for a long time. But recently, Patriarch Bartholomew, he's made that a point to sort of talk about the sort of church schisms there, promoting them in various ways, autonomy, autocephaly, all this other nonsense. And they've actually called him this. So the Russian spies have called Patriarch Bartholomew an antichrist, and they called him a devil in the flesh. So very strong statements. Now, on one hand, the Patriarch Bartholomew does act like an antichrist on occasion. Obviously he does promote schism and does other egregious things, which is why my church, the Russian Orthodox Church, is not in communion with him and we don't commemorate him, correctly so. But I think if you're going to be the Russian spy agency, and Conrad, I think you'd agree, and you are criticizing a hierarch of the Orthodox Church, even with such strong language, just make sure before you look at and inspect the speck of wood in the eye of your neighbor, you don't take out the log first out of your eye, because the log is well and truly there. Like, by that I mean Sergei Naryshkin, the head of the Russian spy agency. We spoke about this on the recent Q&A in episode. In September 2023, Sergei Naryshkin, the head of the SVR, put up a statue to the head of the Red Terror in Moscow, to Dzerzhinsky. And this is 1.5 years into the special military operation. This guy's been praising figures like Iron Felix Dzerzhinsky for many years. He's been promoting this sort of neo-Sovietism, right? Sergei Naryshkin has been. At the same time, he claims to be an Orthodox Christian. So I don't know how this sort of schizophrenic mindset can even exist in the mind of someone who runs Russia's greatest, spy agency around. Even more, in some ways, more important than the FSB today, because Russia is literally conducting itself in all kinds of foreign theaters. It's very concerning that the head of this agency, like similar to, we can look at the head of the CIA and what he believes in, but Sergei Naryshkin does believe in these weird contradictory things. And I don't think he has a right to criticize Patriarch Bartholomew. On one hand, the statement is, it's true, Patriarch Bartholomew is doing egregious things abroad. But on the other hand, can we remove statues to communists who are physically killing and murdering and torturing Orthodox laypersons, clergymen, monastics during the Bolshevik Revolution and the Russian Civil War and thereafter, like Dzerzhinsky? I mean, again, insanity. And so, yeah, the statement in and of itself was hyper-provocative, Conrad, you would agree. That's why the Union Orthodox journalists as well as Orthodox Christian responded. And I think they need to respond to these sort of things.
Yeah, I mean, again, obviously, specifically with the Balkan stuff, I think we would all agree that that's pretty evil and it's very openly schismatic. I mean, the statement says that Bartholomew, mired in the mortal sin of schism, has found common ground with the authorities of the Baltic states whose desire to sow discord in the Russian Orthodox world. I stand by that. But then he goes on, and at one point he says, in order to strike against the especially obstinate Serbian Orthodox Church, he intends to grant autocephaly to the unrecognized Montenegrin Orthodox Church. And look, maybe people in the Thnar have discussed potentially doing this. Maybe they've investigated doing this but ultimately I'm sure they would come to the conclusion that would be dumb, because the Montenegrin Orthodox Church is extremely unpopular. It's not the same as, the Kiev Patriarchate or some of these other bodies in other places, or even the old calendar churches in places like Romania and Greece. But I haven't seen any evidence, and I mean, this is just a claim. I haven't seen any real evidence to see that the FNAR and that the EP was looking at recognizing the Montenegrin Orthodox Church. If you gave me some evidence, it wouldn't be necessarily surprising to me, but I'm just going to need to see that evidence. Like you said, Dimitri, it's not like I'm immediately trusting the Russian CIA about everything, but generally speaking, obviously I would agree with some of the criticism, but of course they have to throw in the neo-Nazi thing in there, which, look, we're all just kind of tired of it. And Constantinople replied, they said that the imaginative scenarios, fake news, insults, and fabricated information of propagandists of every kind do not discourage the Ecumenical Patriarchate from continuing its ministry and ecumenical mission. And frankly, they kind of queued up the EP for a diplomatic W on this one. But, it's still an interesting foray into the ecclesiastical world for the Russian feds nonetheless. But I don't know if you have any other church news stories or any other final pieces of analysis you wanted to give the people this week before we land this plane, Dimitri, but feel free.
Yeah, of course. Just a short and really uplifting story, actually. Metropolitan Longin of the Banchen Monastery, again located in western Ukraine, on the borders of Pridnestrovia, if I'm not mistaken. He's put out a statement on Facebook, so Metropolitan Longin uses Facebook, and he reported in it that, look, we have to, Orthodox Christians in Ukraine, and I think his call is probably for all Orthodox Christians, but specifically those in Ukraine, need to stand up for Metropolitan Arsenius of the Svyatogorsk Monastery, who's currently being persecuted and is facing just a huge health crisis despite being quite a young man relative to the other bishops of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And he's currently in prison. He's still facing, I think, a long legal journey ahead of him as he's being tortured. So that's Metropolitan Longin, someone who himself has been beaten, harassed. Well, I mean, look, long-suffering Metropolitan Longin is perhaps already, I mean, not even perhaps, but he is a confessor of the faith, just de facto. He meets that definition in recent Orthodox history, especially in that of Ukraine. So he's already, if he lives his life out according to the commandments of Christ, I think he's destined for sainthood. So we just have to kind of take that into account. Besides that, a lot of Russian Orthodox Christians have been ridiculing the chief rabbi of Dnieper, Shmuel Kamenetsky. Remember his prediction that, on the 15th of January 2026, the war is going to end because the rabbis told me, and all these important like that. The war has not ended by the 15th of January as we're recording on the 17th. So that's completely thrown out. And all these other stories about there's a lot of Ukrainian Orthodox clergymen still being recruited. So the recruitments that are taking place are in fact still ongoing. There's Orthodox Christian laypersons. The clergymen make the headlines, Conrad. The lay people do not. And that's what I think we also need to mention is the fact that Orthodox Christians in general, men are being stolen, being forced to kill their brothers in the faith, and also literally their physical brothers, the Russians, or even in some cases, their own Ukrainian brothers they're fighting against, the Donetsk, Lugansk people on the front lines. It's all a huge crime. All of these are all members of the church that are being impacted. I think it's almost in its own right. So a piece of church news, because the persecution is not just happening in the churches and monasteries, it's happening in the lives of the Christians of long-suffering Malorussia and Novorossiya. So that I think is the end of the church news for this particular week. But we do have to keep those metropolitans in our prayers, Metropolitan Arsenius, Metropolitan Paul of the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, and all the other hierarchs who are currently suffering these long-term lawsuits, the poisonings. Metropolitan Theodosi fortunately has recovered. Keep all these people in your prayers. Very important just to do that at this time, because at the moment, I think I saw an English-speaking Orthodox Christian posted about it online. Perhaps Father John Whiteford retweeted it as well on X. Ukraine has the most persecution of Christianity, at least Eastern Orthodox Christianity, out of the entire in the entire world. And just thinking about that just sounds absolutely absurd. Like a European developed country doing that, something really, it reeks of the Antichrist spirit, which no doubt will come into this world very soon.
No, it's very true. So we got to keep the Ukrainian Christians in our prayers. I want to encourage everybody, if you haven't already, to watch, speaking of church persecution, watch my interview with Metropolitan Mitrofan of Gorlovka. He discusses this from the perspective of, a Ukrainian bishop himself, a Russian Ukrainian bishop, of course, strong venerator of the Romanov Royal Martyrs. He discusses what it's like. His cathedral's been bombed 4 times. Still a section, a small, 5 or 10% or so of his diocese is still under Ukrainian occupation, and, they're not really even able to reach them. So discussing what it's like to administer a diocese within a war zone, really check that out. It's going to be linked down below. Also check out the latest Ether Hour Q&A. We answer a lot of fantastic questions from our paid supporters, so please consider getting behind the paywall at worldwarnow.co to get access to the entire Metropolitan Mitrofan interview, as well as the entire Q&A episode, and access, of course, to the next Q&A Substack thread that will allow you to ask any question you want to Dimitri and I in an upcoming Q&A episode, which hopefully will be in the next few weeks. We'll get another thread going, so there's not as big of a gap between the Q&A episodes. So be sure to check all of that linked down below, worldwarnow.co. That's how you can really support the show. Be sure to tune in this coming Tuesday. I believe when they're listening to this, it should be a Sunday when this drops. But on Tuesday, I'll be doing World War Live with special guest David Erhan. He will be joining me for a discussion of Turkish politics, the prophecies from the perspective of everything going on in Turkey right now. We'll likely discuss Israel, Iran, the Middle East, Syria as well. And of course, we're going to be playing some ethno-guesser. He really wanted to come on and play some with me. So we're going to be having a great, exciting stream Tuesday evening, the normal time for World War Live, 7:45 Central, 8:45 Eastern Standard Time. So would love to see you there on the World War Now YouTube channel, the World War Now X account, and of course, the World War Now Substack, which again is worldwarnow.co. You can find linked below wherever you may be listening, but be sure to also follow us on X at World War Now _. Follow me on X at GnomeRad. Be sure to find us on Telegram at World War Now Telly. Of course, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. If you just type in World War Now. So we'd love to see you in all of those places. Of course, worldwarnow.co, that's the home base. That's where the episodes drop first. So do not hesitate to get behind the paywall and become a real World War Now patriot. I want to finish off with some fantastic words from Metropolitan Theophitos, something we read at the beginning that expand on the quote a little bit. I know this is like probably the main quote we're going to be going into 2026 with. So I'm so grateful that His Eminence dropped this wisdom on us. But he said, "We have entered, my beloved fathers and brothers, a very dangerous year, as you understand. Some analysts, atheists even, but clever ones, say this may even be the much discussed and prophesied year of world war. You see how everyone gives their instruments, their weapons, but the greatest weapon that Christians have, and indeed is what we experience here in the beautiful church of your community today, in all of us who celebrate the liturgy." And later on, in the same talk, he said, "So let us love the divine liturgy. It is full of energy, many energies, not just one energy, but energies. Some we feel, some we even see clearly, but most of us, or the more like me, we feel them. That is, you receive in the liturgy, I today, because I didn't sleep well yesterday." He goes on and he talks about the good energies of the liturgy and how the energies of the liturgy are what will strengthen us through the Third World War that we are going to be experiencing likely potentially very soon, potentially breaking out as soon as February 2026. So stay vigilant, stay prayerful. And Dimitri, I'll leave you with the final word.
No, absolutely. I completely sign my name under everything you've said, Conrad. And yes, thank you, Metropolitan Theophitos, for, again, putting out these words of wisdom for all of us. I think we're all appreciative of it. And I think thank you, all the listeners who support the show, listen to the end. We have a very special 8th hour episode coming out next week. Subscribe, stay tuned, support us because you guys make it possible. And there's a very interesting series coming up beginning next week. So I won't leave any big spoilers, but the next 8th hour episode will be an exciting one and very provocative in a good way, in the 8th hour sense. So again, thank you for all your support and God bless.